from the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
This is Emilye Crosby with Betty Garman Robinson on December 8th, 2015 in her home in Baltimore. And we're here with the Civil Rights History Project, co-sponsored by the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And also here is John Bishop and Guha Shankar. And thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And can you tell us when and where you were born and about your family?
Sure. I was born on January 8th, 1939. And I was born in New York City. My father was a professor at, maybe, I don't know, full professor. And, you know, now that I know assistant, associate, and whatever, I don't know what kind of professor he was, but he was a professor of physics and chemistry at New York University. And he had grown up on a farm. So he got a college opportunity at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. And then he went to NYU and got a PhD. And that was like big for his family, having, you know, actually his parents were Pennsylvania German. They barely spoke English. So for him, that was big to be catapulted into this position. And my mother was born in New York City in a working class family, born in I don't know if she was born in Flushing, but New York City anyway. Her mother was the daughter of an Irish immigrant, and her father was the son of German immigrants. And so she grew up. She was the first in her family to go to college. She went to NYU also, which is where she met my dad. And then I was born in 39. My brother was born in 42. And what else do you want to know about that?
Well, what was your family like? What was your growing up experience?
Okay. So my growing up experience, both my mother and father, this was like during World War II, right? So my father we moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my father worked at MIT in the radiation lab, which was the laboratory where the atomic bomb was being constructed. And I don't think he knew what part in developing the bomb he was playing, but he had something to do with radar. And so when we had moved to Cambridge, my brother was, well, we were both, you know, preschool, kindergarten age when we lived there. And I can remember the air raids. I can remember the blocking this is again World War II. I can remember the threat of war, so blocking the light from our house with dark curtains, or turning the lights off, or when an air raid would happen, hiding under the bed. I can remember all those things, and I think that connected with my later anti-war sentiments, because as a kid, when you live that trauma, you're not conscious of what those feelings are, but later on it comes to the surface. So there was that piece. Then we moved back to New York, and we moved eventually, by the time I was in second grade, we moved to a suburb, Pleasantville, New York, where there was a new laboratory that my father was working at. He was kind of the chief scientist of it was called General Precision Equipment, or General Precision GPL. It was called General Precision Labs first, then became General Precision Equipment, and then it became something else after that. But so it was in the era where these labs were consolidating and bigger companies were buying them. But I can remember him coming home tormented and upset and really angry and sometimes crying because of the competition and the cutthroat nature of the job that he had and the people around him. And he was a very collaborative type of person, and as a scientist, I think he wanted that collaboration, but there was a lot of jealousy and there was a lot of backbiting, and he was just tortured by all of that happening. So I think then, and we'll jump forward ahead, you know, some of my feelings, like when my brother and I were in college, we talked about how we were not going to work in corporate America because of what we had seen my dad go through. We were like, absolutely no corporate America for us. And that was my brother too. He became a veterinarian, but never worked for a big corporate firm. So that was kind of a key thing in my values formation, I think. And again, reflecting back, I don't know where the values that I got, the progressive values that I got, actually came from. There's other pieces, like my mother was very prejudiced and very, very anti-black, anti-anybody of color. And I would push back against that, I think on one level, because she also was critical of every friend I ever had. So, and those were white friends. So she would say, I don't like her, her parents are immigrants. And I would say, but wait a minute, your grandmother was an immigrant. Or she would say, I don't like this family because they're working class. Or when the first boyfriend I had was the son of a truck driver. And I would be like, wait, there's a contradiction here. Like you grew up the daughter of a carpenter, you know? I mean, it just didn't compute to me. So the fact that she was prejudiced, and then some other incidents that happened, which I can tell you, but I'll let you ask another question.
When you talk about your dad and the work being very competitive and how upsetting, how does that work if he's in the lab? Is it competitive with other scientists, or is there pressure on him because of competition between companies? Do you have a sense of that?
No, I think because it was called GPL, General Precision Labs, but it wasn't a laboratory per se. I mean, they were involved in the first television production. They were involved in a lot of different equipment. The competition was mostly from, if I can remember this well enough, from non-scientists who wanted to be in his position in the corporate structure. In other words, the corporate ladder. So he was given a particular role because of his knowledge and his library. He had books all over his library, all these scientific magazines, and every night he would be reading and poring over all this kind of cutting edge science, because this is the late 40s, right, where science is just blossoming, right? And
but his work is more managerial.
Yes, his work is
scientific.
Exactly more managerial because of the knowledge that he has. So he's not really he's not. I mean, he is, you know, overseeing some of the scientific work, but he's not. But it's not pure scientific, and so he's feeling this competitiveness and this absolute backstabbing and that kind of thing, you know. And so it was kind of like this turmoil and this tension that he brought home almost every night, and then it bled over to my mother and her anxieties about her life, having grown up working class and being, both of them are feeling not accepted in their new class. In other words, they're both feeling very uncomfortable when they go to a party or when they host somebody at the house. They're like very, almost like having six thumbs, you know, and they don't talk about that, but you can tell that that's their discomfort. They never joined a country club. I think that would have been, like, they didn't have the, quote, social graces that they thought was expected of them. I'm sure some of the other people were also going through the same thing, but because nobody talked about anything then, nobody shared any of their deepest feelings, you know.
Did you have a sense of this when you were young, or is this sort of looking back and trying to make sense of what you did experience?
It's partly looking back, but it's partly I can remember the tension around. I can remember my father's anguish and anxiety and anger. I can remember that very, very vividly, but I didn't know how to piece it together. I didn't understand the class stuff until I was out of SNCC probably, or in SNCC. I don't know. I didn't really understand that, and I clearly didn't understand the racial prejudice. Like when I was in high school, my brother and I worked at a YMCA camp, and there was a black woman who was a Vassar student who was a counselor. Now you have to understand, my mother wanted me to go to one of the hotshot women's colleges, and I was like totally resistant to that. No, I'm not going to Smith, Vassar, Wellesley, Radcliffe. No, I'm not going there. So I picked Skidmore, which was kind of up in those ranks, but it was like a lesser than school, right? And of course, my shock when I got to Skidmore, was my roommate brought in 30 pairs of shoes, and this is in 1956, right? And I'm like, what is this, right? So I thought I was rejecting this upper class like life at these other colleges, and bumped right smack into it. But anyway, Vassar was one of the schools that my mother had wanted me to go to and even look at. I refused to even go visit these schools, right? So here we have an African-American woman, Vassar student, on the staff of the YMCA day camp. My brother and I, because we're the brother-sister team, we decide to host a party at our house. So we host a party at our house, all the counselors come, we have a great time, then everybody leaves, and then I'm looking for my mother, and it's like, where is she? And my dad says, well, she's down in the basement. She had a little room, like an office room, where she did sewing and crafts and stuff. So I go down there, and she's in tears. And I'm like, well, what the heck is going on? And she's like, you will never live us down. You brought a nigger into the house. What will the neighbors think? And I'm like, what? Well, my first comment was, well, it's dark. Nobody saw. I mean, that was like the utilitarian way. But the second thing is, well, wait a minute. This is a woman who we work with every day. She's a Vassar student. Like, what objection could you have to that? But because of that, whatever that prejudice that had been built into her life, and I don't know if it was from the immigrant experience. When I look back, for example, she went to Flushing High School. When I look back at her picture, she's got black kids in her class in the 1920s, right? I'm like, well, I don't get it. I don't understand the disconnect, right? So anyway, so those were some of the early experiences that I had, both my mother criticizing who I associated with and my mother criticizing anybody of color. The Puerto Rican mailman was going to poison our dogs, the this, the that. I mean, incredible depth of real, and I think came from her own insecurity is clearly where it came from, right?
So you've talked about a number of these incidents. Do you remember when you first had some inkling of race?
Well, I think at this day camp I worked at, I was in college. In high school, there was one African-American student in my entire 4 years that I was in school. And he was a senior when I was a freshman, and he was the student body president. And then the next 4 years, the next 3 years after that, there was never another black student. There were Jewish students, and I remember not quite understanding what that was about. Not quite getting it, that there were differences in religious beliefs or practices type of thing. I remember in terms of religion, my mother was Catholic, my father was Lutheran, but we never went to church. So kids would say to me, well, what religion are you? And I'd say, oh, I'm Catholic. And they would say, well, we don't see you at church. And I'm like, well, I don't go to church. Like it was some badge of honor, right, that I didn't go to church. And they would like criticize me. So when I was a junior in high school, and I got my driver's license, I started being the super religious type. Go to mass every morning. I got my first communion. I did all that stuff, right? And then...
How long did that last?
Well, it lasted probably into my... the zealousness didn't last after I got to college, but I was pretty regular going to mass when I was in college until my senior year in college. And I go to Cornell, where my brother is now a freshman, and that's it was Easter break. We go to Cornell, and so I go to confession, right? And I tell this priest that I knew, I kind of, it's so funny, everything was so disconnected on some level. So I kind of know that it's not good to read these I'm taking a philosophy course at Skidmore, right? And I kind of knew it wasn't according to church doctrine. You weren't supposed to read this stuff because it would poison your mind, right? So I tell the priest that I'm reading Locke and Rousseau and Hegel and Marx and so on, and he's like aghast, and he's giving me all these Hail Marys that I have to say, and this, repentance I have to do because I'm reading these scholarly books. I walked out of that confessional, I said, I'm finished with Catholicism, right? And in fact, I was finished, except that, I'd go to weddings and funerals and so on.
Where are we going?
You've mentioned to me before that your godmother was Spanish speaking.
She was Mexican, and the way that she got to be my godmother is my father and her husband worked on a book together. And he was a scientist, and they had moved here from Mexico. I never really understood the circumstances or how that happened. But anyway, they worked on a book together, and so I'm sure in the process of working on that book that my mother got to know, Lucy was her name, Lucy Droz, got to know her and asked her to be my godmother when I was born. So then later on, I would say to my mother, well, if you're so and she would also criticize Lucy, my godmother. She would say she speaks broken English, I don't know, all the other things that she would think of about a Spanish-speaking Mexican woman at that point in time. So that was like in the early, like 1940s, mid-40s type of thing. But I mean, I think I said it to her later, probably in the 50s. I said, well, how come you asked her to be my godmother if you have such contempt for her, her persona? And my mother said, well, she's the only Catholic I knew at the time. So that also speaks to me of my mother's isolation, that she didn't have a lot of friends, and she never really did have a lot of friends in her life, except later on when she started doing a lot of service clubs and things like that, going to the nursing home and giving gifts out to people who were sick, or going to the children's home, to the orphans home, whatever it was in that community at that time. So it spoke to her, to me it spoke to her isolation and her fear of having conversation about things with people. And I don't know, was that her upbringing? Probably so. It probably was very closed and very, And also, another thing that's funny is she would talk to me about this woman who lived on her block in Flushing who was a communist. And so she had total contempt for communism. And I was like, well, what does that mean? What's that about, right? I mean, all these things just didn't sink, right? And then later on, of course, when I was both in the movement and when I was a graduate student, I began to understand about the communist organizing around the globe and what that meant, what it signified. And of course, the Russian Revolution was very much in people's minds at that time when I was a grad student, and the African liberation movements and so on. So that I was like steeped in all of that, studying all of that and understanding the contradictions. So it all kind of fell into place, but my mother never really explained the depth of her anxiety about that stuff.
How do you spell Droz?
D-R-O-Z.
Okay. Can you tell us about your experience in college at Skidmore?
Sure. So, I think I was kind of like a regular middle-class college kid. I don't think I stood out at all. I don't think I don't remember anything. The thing that I begin to remember is when, in my sophomore year, I ran for student body secretary, and I ran against a woman who beat me. And then a woman came up to me and she said, would you like to run for NSA secretary? So NSA was the National Student Association, U.S. National Student Association, which was the organization that represented college student leaders all around the country. And I had no clue what that was. And I said, sure, why not, right? So I obviously was into some kind of service or giving back or being engaged in the civic life of the community. So I ran for NSA secretary, maybe it was NSA vice chairman, I think it was, because there was a chairman and a vice chairman. And as a result, I was allowed to go, or given an opportunity to go to Ohio Wesleyan that summer to the National Student Congress. So it was that was the life-changing experience.
Now, is that the meeting every summer that brought people together?
Exactly.
But that wasn't the several-week seminar that Connie Curry was. No, that actually.
No, that's different.
Later.
This was 57, I think. Was it 57? Wait.
She started in that job in 60. So.
So 58, this was the 1958 Student Congress,
Yeah.
and it did bring people together from all across the country. And there were people talking about South African apartheid. There were people talking about segregation in the South, but not as intensely as a few years later.
And you said that was a life-changing?
That was life-changing because here were all these students that were engaged in talking about the world and and talking about political formations and organizing and movements and oppression and all of those words that I wasn't really familiar with, right? So I go back to campus. I was a psych major before that, so I changed my major to political science. Well, first I was a math major. Okay, that's another story. I was a math major because my father anticipated the rise of computers and the importance of computers. And he said to me, you got to be a math major. Look, you're very good in math, which I was, and you've got to be a math major. So I go to Skidmore. There's one professor in the math department, a woman who I just didn't feel, I didn't have any synchronicity with her. So I changed my major to psychology when I was a freshman. But then I come back after my experience at the National Student Congress, I come back, change my major to political science, and that's when I began to really delve into political ideas and debates and ideological discussions and all of that kind of thing. So that's kind of why that was life-changing. And then the next spring, I run for student body president, the spring of my junior year, which is 59 spring. I lose to the same woman that beat me for secretary. And then I'm asked to run for NSA chairman. I do that. And so then I go to the National Student Congress that summer. It's at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. Again, students come from all over. And, you have this incredible experience. You learn for some of us, the initial thing that we got involved in was student voice on campus. So it was about having a say in how good or bad the professors were, or having a say in the kind of college life, mundane things like what the dormitory hours were, or whether we had an honor system in the dorms, and there were a lot of different things that we wanted to take on.
Did women have different rules on Skidmore's campus than men? Was there a...
Well, it was it was a women's college.
Skidmore was all...
It was all women until more recently.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was all women, but we had pretty strict rules, and we had this thing called in loco parentis, which meant the college was standing in the place of your parents, and so it was very regimented. And if there were women who went out on a date and came in the back window, somebody helped them unlock the window and come in so they could sneak past the house mother type of thing. But it was very, it was very cocoon-like type of thing. So
when you start going to these NSA meetings, is there any sense on campus of rebelling against this sort of strict control, or is that just...
Some of it's there. I don't think that's the major thing. I mean, I think one of the things that the first campaign that I kind of got involved in was around the National Defense Education Act. And I think it's because this was an NSA campaign. So this was to fight against the loyalty oath in the National Defense Education Act, which said if you were going to get a scholarship or a loan from the federal government, you had to swear that you were not then or had ever been a communist, a member of the Communist Party. I forget how the oath went. But I had taken the civil liberties course from this fabulous professor about loyalty oaths. I mean, one of the pieces was about loyalty oaths, about you shouldn't be forced to take a loyalty oath. So I'm applying my political science and getting involved in this campaign. So we had students writing letters to their local papers in their hometowns, and we had people sending postcards to their congressmen and that kind of thing. So that's, again, it's this connection to what's the role of a citizen in a democracy, and how can we encourage that citizenship and that involvement. So, and that was the big NSA mantra, was involvement in your life of your community or your college or whatever. So
do you remember hearing about the civil rights movement or thinking about it much?
Well, yes, and in fact, what happened is that in the this is when we're doing this National Defense Education Act campaign. This is early 1960, and I had okay, yeah. So I'm the NSA chairman. I'm getting all this information through NSA, either through phone calls or through letters. And 1960 happens, and the student sit-ins happen. So and I don't remember if NSA encouraged us to do something, but we had these big meetings on campus. We had a Woolworths in our town in Saratoga Springs. So we began to have these student meetings where we debated what we could do to support the Southern students, or if we should. I think part of the question was, should we support the Southern students? And I actually have a leaflet, which I should have gotten out to show you. I can get it later. It says, it's something like the right to eat. It's a human right, and black students, it says Negro students in the South don't have the right to eat at lunch counters, and this is outrageous and shocking, and we need to come together to discuss this and talk about what to do. And so we did that. We came together and we decided after 4 very heated meetings. I mean, it was my first experience with what democratic discussion and debate might be like, because we had every point of view in the book. So we decided we would plan a protest, and we took 200 women students from campus down to the Woolworths, walked around the Woolworths, and came back to campus. So there were a couple of freshman students that said, we can't stop here. Or actually, a freshman and a sophomore student, and they said, we can't stop here, we can't do this. We got to keep going. So we sent 4 students. The plan was we sent 4 students every hour the next day to picket at the Woolworths, right? The first 4 students that went got picked up by the police, taken to the police station, and one of the students' father was an attorney, so she knew that you didn't have to give your name or your address until you were actually charged with a crime. So the front page of the Saratoga paper that day has 4 students like this with their hands over their eyes, blocking their faces, and the article is "Skiddies more than they bargained for." and the editorial says we were unladylike, we never should have picketed. What was that about? The police are prepared to charge the students with a statute that was meant for union busting, basically. No picketing within 100 yards of something or other. But the Woolworths is private property. This is the beginning of the shopping center boom, where this whole square and the parking lot are owned by the corporation, and so you can't go next to the store to disrupt the business at all. So,
can I interject?
Yes.
So you said that the plan was to send 4 every hour, and the
Yes.
first 4 are arrested. Do people continue
No,
after that?
nobody continues. No, the panic button is hit. The president of the college calls us in. We sit down in his office. He reads us the riot act. He tells us we have to cease and desist, that this is not appropriate, it's not right. And so and actually spring break was the next day. So the spring break dissipated the energy. And go ahead.
Were you surprised by the arrests?
I was shocked. I mean, again, you grow up with the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment freedoms, and you think everybody has the right to express their opinion. And we had peacefully done the march down. It was maybe 5 or 6 blocks from campus, so we went down and then around the Woolworths and came back. And actually, in the Skidmore history book, there are some pictures of that fabulous picket. And so, yes, I think we were shocked. We were like, what? Got arrested? I mean, or taken to the police station, not charged formally, released to, in loco parentis, released to the father of the president of the college, right? So that was pretty, and so we really understood that we were fighting for our own right to be free, and that there was a connection between supporting the Southern students and our own exercise of our own rights. So that, again, for me, that was a lesson in how everything is connected, that if you step out of line, so to speak, and you protest something that's not acceptable to the people in power, you also get, in this case, slapped down, because no untoward consequence. Nobody got a record, and nobody got, fingerprinted, and nobody got handcuffed and type of thing. But still, you get cut off from being able to do that kind of thing. So
you said that the spring break kind of dissipated the energy. Did you all resume any kind of protest activity afterwards?
we didn't, and I really just another thing, that spring break was when SNCC was founded, and I considered going to Shaw to be at that founding meeting, but I was terrified of my mother's response, and in fact, that's. I had had a letter in the Hastings newspaper. They lived in Hastings on Hudson. I had a letter in the Hastings newspaper just before I came home for spring break about the National Defense Education Act, which that threw them for a loop. She told me don't show up in the house until after dark, because she didn't want her, and she was having some kind of women over for tea or something like that. So, but she didn't want me to have any relationship with any of her friends or her, whatever, her service buddies. So then at the same time, I'm really terrified that if I try to go to Shaw, she'll be really upset and angry. So I didn't push it. But one of the freshman students who had pushed for us to go down and picket the second day, she went, actually. Her name was Linda Chase, and I've actually lost total track of her. I can't find her anywhere, so I don't know. She dropped out of Skidmore, or left Skidmore after 2 years, I think. So, but I'm always curious as what was her journey after that? Where did she go and what did she do? Yeah,
so
and
she's pushing.
Yeah, because here she is a freshman, and she's pushing that we continue and we escalate and so on, and
Can you remember? Can you go back and are you able to recreate what you were thinking about the SNCC conference, or how you knew about it, or what it meant to you?
Well, I think I thought the students were extremely courageous, the sit-in students. And because I felt so kind of like the cover being pulled off the U.S. for me, all the kind of the ideals and values that we believed in, and then the contradiction showing up that black students couldn't sit at lunch. I was floored. I think because again we didn't grow up with this. I grew up with a prejudiced mother, but I didn't grow up where black people couldn't go into grocery stores or Woolworth lunch counters or whatever if they lived in those communities. There were lots of things as a white person I never thought about. So I didn't think about the absence of black people in my school or the absence of black people in my community. I didn't think about that, I didn't understand the privilege that white people had in that era, especially the GI Bill of Rights or the FHA and the VA loans for houses where you were required to buy a house in a stable community, and stable community for sure meant a racially homogeneous community. So, but we didn't, those privileges we didn't have a good understanding of what, and nobody alerted us to the fact that there were these discrepancies. So we saw students not able to eat at a lunch counter. That was the tip of the iceberg. Ella Baker was very much a mentor for all of us. She always talked about it's more than a hamburger. So we had to move from the lunch counter sit-ins to some bigger issues.
Do you remember how you found out about the SNCC founding conference?
I'm not sure. It must have been through NSA, and maybe it was the sit-in students, because it wasn't called SNCC at the time, right? Yeah, it would have been the sit-in students are gathering at Shaw in Raleigh, and they're going to talk about, the next steps or their strategy or something like that. So I'm sure it was through NSA that I heard about it. And maybe NSA invited some of the students who had been leaders on the campus because all over, one of the things we did was, of course, this is in the nature of competition. And on this leaflet that I've saved, we talk about how at Yale and Wellesley and Smith and they're supporting the sit-in students, so we need to be supporting the sit-in students as well, right?
So you're doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And when you graduated, you went to work for the NSA?
When I graduated, I was invited to be part of something called the International Student Relations Seminar, the ISRIS, is that right? Yes, the ISRIS, the International Relations Students, the International Student Relations Seminar. So that you live in Philadelphia for 2 months. There were about 12 of us in this ISRIS session. There were 2 women, and all the rest were men, very intellectual men. And what it turned out, only again in retrospect, it was the training ground for future NSA officers and for CIA service. So the National Student Association's international program was funded by the CIA through a lot of subterfuges, through foundation conduits and that kind of thing. And then when the student travelers went overseas to either Latin America or Europe or the Soviet Union or Africa, they took notes on who were the emerging leaders, who were the students that were organizing the liberation movements, what were their ideologies, were they sympathetic to the US or not, and then all of those notes went directly to the CIA. So it was the way the CIA, the notes and I'm sure the interviews, I mean, there's a new book, which is actually on my shelf over there, that red and blue book, you see right there, what's it called? Patriotic Betrayal. Yeah, sure. Let's hold it up. So this is by a woman who and I believe her husband also, they had been in the CIA, they had been in the NSA, and when they learned about the CIA connection, they were like shocked also, and so she set about doing this scholarship, doing this scholarship, and it just came out maybe 2011, 2012, 2013, something like that.
I know that it was a real shock to a lot of people when they learned of the connection between the
Absolutely.
NSA and the CIA.
Absolutely.
With the students, this is a little bit of field, but with the students who are traveling overseas and taking these notes, do they know what they're doing? Do they know that that's...
Some of them do. Some of them do. The way it worked was this. First of all, in my ISRIS, there was a guy who was already on the CIA payroll. So that's...
He's also a student or a recent graduate?
He's pretending. I don't know. I don't know his whole story, but I guess he's pretending that he's in the seminar because he was a student leader on campus or something like that. So there are plants, there are CIA plants in these seminars. There are also former NSA officers who have been recruited by the CIA who are the trainers for these sessions. And, you know, of course, we're going through a country-by-country synopsis. What are the student movements in those countries? What do they look like? What are the politics of the way governments are constructed and that kind of thing. So that's another piece. So there's CIA agents in the ISRIS. There's CIA agents who are former NSA officers, and nobody tells you that they're CIA. No, it's all hidden. And then the third thing is, it's the way that they vet people for NSA office. So if you're in this ISRIS, you have this potential to become the international vice president, for example, of the National Student Association. And then what happens is, once the Student Congress happens, and there's all this manipulation to get the right people in office. So they're clearly looking for people who are going to be sympathetic to the U.S. foreign policy constellation of issues, and therefore sympathetic to the CIA's values. So then once you're in office, they take you out and they tell you that the CIA is bankrolling the international program. And they make you witting, W-I-T-T-I-N-G. So then the code word becomes, are you witting? And everybody, you know, if you're not witting, you say, huh? And if you are witting, you say, yes, I'm witting. And so then they can have their conversations. So whether, and I haven't read enough of this patriotic portrayal to know if the student travelers knew that they were feeding, did they know that the CIA had a hand in bankrolling their work because that's what happened. The travel fees and all of that were donated by the CIA through these foundation conduits.
Well, I know that
Yeah.
Tim Jenkins was active in NSA as a Howard student and
Yes.
student body president, and he's told me that he had hoped to be the vice president for international affairs, and got sort of maneuvered over into
To national.
domestic.
Yes, they
Yeah.
probably didn't trust him.
And of course that
And
ended
he's a black student too, and that's unusual in the NSA. It's somewhat unusual to have a black officer. So he gets maneuvered over to national vice president,
And
yes.
of course, it's interesting because then he's in the position of national vice president
Exactly.
when the sit-ins start.
Exactly.
And he becomes an advocate within the NSA.
Exactly. So there was a woman who was the International Affairs Vice President of the IAVP, and apparently the year before this, apparently they didn't trust her either, and so they didn't make her witting. And the guy who was the administrator of the international program had to carry all that secrecy and the decisions and the strategy. So, there was clearly a lot of sexism as well as racism in the day. So.
Yeah. So after you went to that workshop,
The ISRIS. So I go to the National Student Congress, which is in Minnesota that year. And one fabulous thing about
is
that.
the year you graduated?
Yes, that's 60.
Right.
It's
Yes,
1960.
right.
So I go to Minnesota that summer. And I can't remember, is that when Tim is elected? Or he's elected, he's the year before? I can't remember. Anyway.
Tim's works for the NSA 1959-60.
Okay, so he's in office when I go to the ISRIS that summer. Okay. So, what was I starting to say?
You were talking about going to the conference.
Going to the Congress in Minnesota, yes. So one of the things the CIA also did, which you only learn about in retrospect, is they brought Algerian revolutionary students to the U.S. for a month. And under the auspices of NSA, right, to have a conference and meeting. So I go to Minnesota a little bit early because I'm in this ISRIS program, and I experience the energy and the enthusiasm and the excitement of these students who are meeting and singing, and they're in solidarity with each other in such phenomenal ways. I'm just swept up by the energy that they're putting out in their meetings, right? I mean, I wasn't in most of their meetings, but I was in some of their social gatherings and the singing and of course I didn't understand the words because it was in French, but it was still.
So when you're talking about the group and the energy and their support,
It's the Algerian students.
All Algerian.
Exactly. And these are the students who then become the leaders of the Algerian Revolution. So go back, or maybe they're already involved. I don't know the dates of the Algerian Revolution, but to me that was a cathartic experience to see this excitement about fighting for freedom, basically, is what it was, right? So after the Student Congress, I go to California. I have a boyfriend who is also in the ISRIS, who's going to be a political science grad student at Berkeley. So I take a job as a campus traveler to sell tours to Europe for NSA. And I go to Berkeley, I live there. I actually lived in Oakland. And I travel to every college on the West Coast: Oregon, California, Idaho, Washington, etc. Every single campus that exists at the time. And that was kind of, I did it by myself. I was on a bus going from college to college. And then I get a call in late November, saying that the assistant to the president of NSA is going to resign, and would I come to and live in Philadelphia to be the assistant to the president. So I do. I had broken up with this guy by then, right? So I don't have any other ties to Berkeley, except I loved it out there. And so I come back to Philadelphia, and I'm the one who organizes the National Student Congress for the next summer at University of Wisconsin.
So that would have been fall of 60 then?
This is November of 60. I go back to Philadelphia, and I live in Philadelphia from November of 60 up until summer of 61. when the National Student Congress takes place at the University of Wisconsin. And I'm the person, the logistics person, and the one who figures out all the dormitory stuff, the rooms, the audio-visual setup, the lunches. I go out to Wisconsin 3 or 4 times and negotiate with the university officials. And that's kind of like a big step for me. I'm a year out of college, and I'm given this huge responsibility to pull this conference off. And I do, and then this is the summer that I meet the SDS people, and I meet the liberal study group with quotes around it, happens at the Congress, that Al Haber and Tom Hayden and others are pulling people together to have discussions about U.S. imperialism and capitalism and the war, the Cold War and all of that context. So this is 61. In fact, Port Huron is 62 summer, so it's the run-up to Port Huron. So SDS is obviously using some of these forums as ways to identify students who have a similar thinking and can be recruited for the building of the SDS chapters around the country.
Let me ask you a couple questions.
Sure.
Were all of the NSA sort of leaders elected? Well, I guess you just said that there was a woman who was the domestic vice chair the year before Tim.
She wasn't the domestic, she was the international vice chair,
right,
and they didn't trust her.
They didn't trust her.
Yeah.
Were most of the NSA national officers men?
Yes. It was very rare to have a woman. There were 3, there was the president, and then the NAVP, the National Affairs Vice President, and the IAVP, the International Affairs Vice President. So there were 3 officers, basically, and they were mostly men.
And what about the position that you had, the sort of assistant to, is that generally a female job?
I think it would have been either. It was just somebody who had the logistical, the administrative experience and could do that. Yeah, could do that kind of work. So I think mostly it was women, but you know, I don't know.
Was it perceived as a sort of a secretarial thing, or how?
I think it was a semi-secretarial thing. Yeah, I mean, I think so.
You mentioned that you were at the 1960 Congress in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember there was a panel that
there was, and Casey gave a fabulous speech. I remember she gave, and I think maybe, I don't know if Tim was on the panel too, but I remember something, and that was the summer that Connie also had the Southern Student Human Relations Seminar, right?
Yes.
And so brought Southern students, black and white Southern students. I can remember Casey's speech. I mean, I can remember being in the audience and how electric it felt, and you know, she was taking a step way out there, and it was pretty powerful.
Yeah, so I think that there was, Tim, I'm sure, was part of it, but there was a group that was leading a push for the NSA to pass a resolution in support of the sit-in movement, and then some sort of Southern students are opposing it, and I think Casey gets recruited to be on this panel of Southern students. And so it's interesting, you know. So
she gets recruited to be on the panel to oppose the push, or they think she's going to?
Well, I think that the NSA leadership who was trying to get the resolution passed,
I see,
was looking for supporters to put on that
panel. Put on the Southern panel. Okay, I understand. Okay, that's some backstory. Oh, I think John is.
Robinson on December 8th, 2015 in her home in Baltimore. And we're here with the Civil Rights History Project, co-sponsored by the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And also here is John Bishop and Guha Shankar. And thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And can you tell us when and where you were born and about your family?
Sure. I was born on January 8th, 1939, and I was born in New York City. My father was a professor at full professor. And, you know, now that I know assistant, associate, and whatever, I don't know what kind of professor he was, but he was a professor of physics and chemistry at New York University. And he had grown up on a farm. So he got a college opportunity at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania, and then he went to NYU and got a PhD. And that was like big for his family, having, you know, actually his parents were Pennsylvania German. They barely spoke English. So for him, that was big be to be catapulted into this position. And my mother was born in New York City in a working class family, born in I don't know if she was born in Flushing, but New York City anyway. Her mother was the daughter of an Irish immigrant, and her father was the son of German immigrants. And so she grew up, she was the first in her family to go to college. She went to NYU also, which is where she met my dad. And then I was born in 39, my brother was born in 42. And what else do you want to know about that?
Well, what was your family like? What was your growing up experience?
Okay. So my growing up experience, both my mother and father, this was like during World War II, right? So my father we moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my father worked at MIT in the radiation lab, which was the laboratory where the atomic bomb was being constructed. And I don't think he knew what part in developing the bomb he was playing, but he had something to do with radar. And so when we had moved to Cambridge, my brother was, well, we were both, preschool, kindergarten age when we lived there. And I can remember the air raids. I can remember the blocking this is again World War II. I can remember the threat of war, so blocking the light from our house with dark curtains, or turning the lights off, or when an air raid would happen, hiding under the bed. I can remember all those things, and I think that connected with my later anti-war sentiments, because as a kid, when you live that trauma, you're not conscious of what those feelings are, but later on it comes to the surface. So there was that piece. Then we moved back to New York, and we moved, eventually, by the time I was in second grade, we moved to a suburb, Pleasantville, New York, where there was a new laboratory that my father was working at. He was kind of the chief scientist of it was called General Precision Equipment, or General Precision GPL. It was called General Precision Labs first, then became General Precision Equipment, and then it became something else after that. But so it was in the era where these labs were consolidating and bigger companies were buying them. But I can remember him coming home tormented and upset and really angry and sometimes crying because of the competition and the cutthroat nature of the job that he had and the people around him. And he was a very collaborative type of person, and as a scientist, I think he wanted that collaboration, but there was a lot of jealousy and there was a lot of backbiting, and he was just tortured by all of that happening. So I think then, and we'll jump forward ahead, some of my feelings, like when my brother and I were in college, we talked about how we were not going to work in corporate America because of what we had seen my dad go through. We were like, absolutely no corporate America for us. And that was my brother too. He became a veterinarian, but never worked for a big corporate firm. So that was kind of a key thing in my values formation, I think. And again, reflecting back, I don't know where the values that I got, the progressive values that I got, actually came from. There's other pieces, like my mother was very prejudiced and very, very anti-Black, anti-anybody of color. And I would push back against that, I think on one level, because she also was critical of every friend I ever had. So, and those were white friends. So she would say, I don't like her, her parents are immigrants. And I would say, but wait a minute, your grandmother was an immigrant. Or she would say, I don't like this family because they're working class. Or when the first boyfriend I had was the son of a truck driver. And I would be like, wait, there's a contradiction here. Like you grew up the daughter of a carpenter, I mean, it just didn't compute to me. So the fact that she was prejudiced, and then some other incidents that happened, which I can tell you, but I'll let you ask another question.
When you talk about your dad and the work being very competitive and how upsetting, How does that work if he's in the lab? Is that competitive with other scientists, or is there pressure on him because of competition between companies? Do you have a sense of that?
No, I think because it was called GPL, General Precision Labs, but it wasn't a laboratory per se. I mean, they were involved in the first television production. They were involved in a lot of different equipment. The competition was mostly from, if I can remember this well enough, from non-scientists who wanted to be in his position in the corporate structure. In other words, the corporate ladder. So he was given a particular role because of his knowledge and his library. He had books all over his library, all these scientific magazines, and every night he would be reading and poring over all this kind of cutting edge science, because this is the late 40s, right, where science is just blossoming, right? And
but his work is more
managerial. Yes, his work is scientific. Exactly, more managerial because of the knowledge that he has. So he's not really he's not. I mean, he is, overseeing some of the scientific work, but he's not. But it's not pure scientific, and so he's feeling this competitiveness and this absolute backstabbing and that kind of thing, and so it was kind of like this turmoil and this tension that he brought home almost every night, and then it bled over to my mother and her anxieties about her life, having grown up working class and being, both of them are feeling not accepted in their new class. In other words, they're both feeling very uncomfortable when they go to a party or when they host somebody at the house. They're like almost like having six thumbs, and they don't talk about that, but you can tell that that's their discomfort. They never joined a country club. I think that would have been, like, they didn't have the, quote, social graces that they thought was expected of them. I'm sure some of the other people were also going through the same thing, but because nobody talked about anything then, nobody shared any of their deepest feelings,
Did you
So.
Did you have a sense of this when you were young, or is this sort of looking back and trying to make sense of what you did experience?
It's partly looking back, but it's partly I can remember the tension around. I can remember my father's anguish and anxiety and anger. I can remember that very, very vividly, but I didn't know how to piece it together. I didn't understand the class stuff until I was out of SNCC probably, or in SNCC. I don't know. I didn't really understand that, and I clearly didn't understand the racial prejudice. Like when I was in high school, my brother and I worked at a YMCA camp, and there was a black woman who was a Vassar student who was a counselor. Now you have to understand, my mother wanted me to go to one of the hotshot women's colleges, and I was like totally resistant to that. No, I'm not going to Smith, Vassar, Wellesley, Radcliffe. No, I'm not going there. So I picked Skidmore, which was kind of up in those ranks, but it was like a lesser than school, right? And of course, my shock when I got to Skidmore was my roommate brought in 30 pairs of shoes, and this is in 1956, right? And I'm like, what is this, right? So I thought I was rejecting this upper class like life at these other colleges, and bumped right smack into it. But anyway, Vassar was one of the schools that my mother had wanted me to go to and even look at. I refused to even go visit these schools, right? So here we have an African-American woman, Vassar student, on the staff of the YMCA day camp. My brother and I, because we're the brother-sister team, we decide to host a party at our house. So we host a party at our house, all the counselors come, we have a great time, then everybody leaves, and then I'm looking for my mother, and it's like, where is she? And my dad says, well, she's down in the basement. She had a little room, like an office room, where she did sewing and crafts and stuff. So I go down there, and she's in tears. And I'm like, well, what the heck is going on? And she's like, you will never live us down. You brought a nigger into the house. What will the neighbors think? And I'm like, what? Well, my first comment was, well, it's dark. Nobody saw. I mean, that was like the utilitarian way. But the second thing is, well, wait a minute. This is a woman who we work with every day. She's a Vassar student. Like, what objection could you have to that? But because of that, whatever that prejudice that had been built into her life. And I don't know if it was from the immigrant experience. When I look back, for example, she went to Flushing High School. When I look back at her picture, she's got black kids in her class in the 1920s, right? I'm like, well, I don't get it. I don't understand the disconnect, right? So anyway, so those were some of the early experiences that I had, both my mother criticizing who I associated with and my mother criticizing anybody of color. The Puerto Rican mailman was going to poison our dogs, the this, the that. I mean, incredible depth of real, and I think came from her own insecurity is clearly where it came from, right?
So you've talked about a number of these incidents. Do you remember when you first had some inkling of race?
Well, I think at this day camp I worked at, I was in college. In high school, there was one African-American student in my entire 4 years that I was in school. And he was a senior when I was a freshman, and he was the student body president. And then the next 4 years, the next 3 years after that, there was never another black student. There were Jewish students, and I remember not quite understanding what that was about. Not quite getting it, that there were differences in religious beliefs or practices type of thing. I remember in terms of religion, my mother was Catholic, my father was Lutheran, but we never went to church. So kids would say to me, well, what religion are you? And I'd say, oh, I'm Catholic. And they would say, well, we don't see you at church. And I'm like, well, I don't go to church. Like it was some badge of honor, right, that I didn't go to church. And they would like criticize me. So when I was a junior in high school, and I got my driver's license, I started being the super religious type. Go to mass every morning. I got my first communion. I did all that stuff, right? And then...
How long did that last?
Well, it lasted probably into my... the zealousness didn't last after I got to college, but I was pretty regular going to mass when I was in college until my senior year in college. And I go to Cornell, where my brother is now a freshman, and that's it was Easter break. We go to Cornell, and so I go to confession, right? And I tell this priest that I knew, I kind of, it's so funny, everything was so disconnected on some level. So I kind of know that it's not good to read these I'm taking a philosophy course at Skidmore, right? And I kind of knew it wasn't according to church doctrine. You weren't supposed to read this stuff because it would poison your mind, right? So I tell the priest that I'm reading Locke and Rousseau and Hegel and Marx and so on, and he's like aghast, and he's giving me. Yeah.
Okay, we're back.
So can you tell us do you have memories of that Thanksgiving meeting that SNCC held at Howard in 1963?
The biggest memory I have of is the singing. That's the most incredible thing. Standing in a circle, singing all the freedom songs, and then people with tears streaming down their eyes singing "We Shall Overcome" at the very end of the meeting. I mean, I think that's the emotional connection that I had to the movement, was the singing, and the understanding how song really pushed you forward, gave you some courage to do some things that you maybe hadn't dreamed that you would do, and the community, the collectivity of that moment, of those moments where people were singing and they were united in that power. I mean, it's kind of the same thing I described with the Algerian students, and the power of that singing and that camaraderie. Those were the things, partly it was probably because of the way I was raised, without a lot of that feeling and emotion happening. I don't know, just so those moments, those emotional moments where you could open up and be connected with people were kind of your, the thing.
I know some of these networks and some of these people are very interconnected with NSA and SDS.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, I left something out. The Southern Student Freedom Fund. But I'll come back to that.
Okay. And but I was so you end up sort of focusing, you're moving into SNCC.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of why you became more engaged with SNCC and as opposed to continuing with SDS?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Good question, because I was thinking I also didn't bring up the SDS stuff completely. So so I go to California thinking that I'm going to, with this other woman, Becky Mills, that we're going to start an SDS chapter. And we just somehow never get it off the ground, maybe because I get involved in the civil rights support work. And but at the same time, I'm staying connected with SDS because by the, I can't remember if it's by the, it's not the summer of 62. Maybe it is the summer of 62 after Port Huron. So summer of 62, I also go to the World Youth Festival in Helsinki, which is another piece. Okay, so the World Youth Festival is run by the Soviet bloc, and it's WFDY, the WFDY, World Forum of Democratic Youth, which is the Soviet bloc's name for this. There's the WFDY, and there's another one that the West uses, the Europeans and the US, but I can't remember its name offhand. So, so I go to Helsinki, I go to the Helsinki Youth Festival under the auspices of the IRS, which is the International Relations something seminar, maybe. I don't know. It's a thing that Gloria Steinem is connected to. It's funded by the CIA. She knows it's funded by the CIA. And this other guy, Harold Bakken, who was an NSA president back in the late 40s, early 50s. So they recruit a whole bunch of us to go to Helsinki to be the alternative to the Soviet line, but we're like no testing East or West people. We're like anti-nuclear. We're supposed to be the radical students from the US who are maybe socialist, but not pro-communist, if you want to. I mean, that's like a weird distinction, but they, you know, there was the democratic socialist movement in the US, so there was the Michael Harrington folks who were anti-communist, viciously anti-communist. Those were the people that, rambling now, but those were the people that were the fathers of SDS, meaning SLID, the SLID and LID, the League for Industrial Democracy. These were viciously anti-communist socialists. And Michael Harrington was one of that group, and the Norman Thomas socialists, so to speak. So, and then SLID was the Student League for Industrial Democracy, which was the student arm, which was kind of the auspices under which SDS initially collected, and then there was a break. So I went to this meeting in New York. I was put on the SDS executive committee, and I don't remember when or why or how come, but maybe because I was a student at Berkeley and they imagined that, you know, I would really be doing some organizing work at Berkeley. I hadn't really cut my teeth on organizing yet, but they put me there. So, so in the summer of 62, I believe after Port Huron, the reason I didn't go to Port Huron is because I went to the World Festival, I went to the Congress, the World Youth Congress, whatever it was called. What did I say it was called? The Festival of Democratic Youth, something like that. So I went to that instead of Port Huron. But when I came back, we were at a meeting in New York with the LID, the League for Industrial Democracy people, and this was when the split happened between LID and SDS. So, and other people can give you much better detail if this is an area of interest. But I can remember a guy named Mickey Most banging his hand on the table and screaming, "Those bloody communists, they're this, they're that, they're this, and they're that." And of course, this is in the context of, right, this is post the Stalin purges and all of that. What did I know about any of that stuff? I didn't know. You know, and probably not too many people in the US knew about that because it was kept under wraps. So, but this guy is just foaming at the mouth and he's really angry and pissed. And so I can remember those kind of emotional moments as the hallmark of these experiences. But anyway, at this World Festival of Democratic Youth, or the international, whatever it was called, I don't have the right name for it yet. The idea was we got free housing and in exchange for writing up notes about what we were experiencing. Like, so any panels that we went to, we had to write who was on the panel, what they said, et cetera, and we would turn the notes in, and that was why we got the free housing. So that was the CIA MO in that day. And we didn't realize that we really thought that we were representing an alternate view of the U.S., that we were organizing for more freedom and democracy at home, and because we were anti-war, also we were no testing east or west. In fact, I went to a demonstration in the main square in Helsinki, which was a no testing east or west demonstration, and people had signs, and the people with the signs had the shit beat out of them by the Helsinki police, because that was a communist-controlled country at the time. So those people were like just demolished right in front of me. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is an example of what happens internationally when you're taking a stand that's different from the establishment.
So you did some of that background on SDS and what you were doing in response to my question about why you pursued SNCC instead of SDS.
Oh, but I didn't finish the answer. The answer was because in SDS, I really was a wallflower, and I was, as a woman, I don't think I was respected or encouraged or affirmed. I was in awe of the men and their intellect and their conversation and so on, but I wasn't affirmed in that space. So in the SNCC space, because I could take initiative, because I could rise to the occasion, I could do something concrete, and I got affirmed by Jim Foreman and by Casey that I was doing a good thing and that I was needed and necessary and important. And that was probably one of the reasons. Maybe they had in mind that they were going to recruit me to come south and I should come to the Howard meeting so they could check me out further. But I knew Casey from SDS circles, and that may have been one of the reasons that Casey left SDS as well, although I know that she split from Tom, so that may have been part of it as well. But she was Southern, and so this SNCC experience fit more with her perspective about the world. So, but that's kind of it in a nutshell, is the affirmation and the kind of the knowing that you could. And then also SNCC was much more dynamic at the time. I mean, SDS, we were in our heads all the time. We weren't doing any action. There were no real organizing campaigns unless you were on a campus. Like, some of the campus newspapers got censored because they were writing radical things, all of those kinds of things. So if you were on a campus and you worked with SDS, and there were political parties, there was Toxin, there was, I forget there was Slate in California, and there was another one in Michigan's campus that were running radical students for student government office and that kind of thing. So those would have been exciting campaigns to be involved in, but I think the fact that I was affirmed in the fact that I could really make a contribution with the fundraising and the organizing, the political organizing. So I went south.
I haven't really made a study of SDS, but when I've looked at some of the documents here and there, I have a sense that it was a little more male than SNCC was.
Very much more male. Oh, way more male. I mean, I think, now I don't know about the chapters on the campuses, but I think very often, in fact, I see it being recreated now in the student movement, is sometimes when there are organizations that are headed by males, the women involved are the partners of the men. So in SDS, that was another thing, is the women involved were partners with the men. So that was how they got involved. They didn't necessarily get involved because they had some independent presence and independent organizing thrust. And again, that was because of the day, although even now I'm seeing it recreated in some of the organizations.
That must be kind of strange.
It is. And I think they're struggling more with it. I mean, I think people are aware enough that they're saying, hey, wait, you look at the way you're organized, you got to deal with this.
And of course, that's interesting because Casey was an activist in her own right.
In her own right, exactly.
Which made her slightly different than some of the other
women. Exactly. Yeah.
So
exactly.
You come south to the Atlanta office in March, and if I understand the chronology right, Casey is sort of the first northern coordinator for
Exactly.
SNCC, and then Dinky
Exactly.
Romilly picks it up.
Exactly.
And then she goes back to New York, I think.
She goes
You
back to New
replace
York.
her?
No, I don't replace her right away. When I come to SNCC in March of '64, Dinky is the northern coordinator. We work together. I go to Mississippi for the summer, so I'm the lead northern coordinator in the Greenwood office during summer '64. And Dottie and Judy are there, both also working. They work on the press stuff primarily. And then in the fall of '64,
So Dottie Zellner and
Judy Richardson, I'm sorry.
And so this is part of SNCC kind of relocates the national office
Exactly.
to Greenwood in
Exactly.
the Freedom Summer.
During Freedom Summer, it's SNCC making a statement about its commitment to the Freedom Summer organizing. And so it opens an office in Greenwood, and it picks Greenwood as the Delta because that's the place where there are the least number of people, black people voting, and where the heaviest oppression in the state of Mississippi, or one of the places where the heaviest oppression happens in the Delta, which is, it's part of the Black Belt of the South.
You started to jump to fall '64. Were you going to sort of go on to what you were doing then?
No, fall '64 is when Dinky Romilly moves to New York, and I become the northern coordinator. I get the title of the northern coordinator title.
So can you describe for us what the Atlanta office was like when you come, and sort of what you remember about it and what kind of work you did?
Right. So I come in March of '64. I find a group of people that are working really hard, that are absolutely dedicated. All the things that I imagined, like people working in solidarity, in camaraderie, foreman sweeping, foreman having us pick up, him kind of like organizing us to make a family out of this space. A number of people that I got to be friends with the people who are the bottom, I don't want to say the bottom layer because that's not really true, but the people who were not the big names, the Jim Foremans and the John Lewises. Of course you get to know them, and you sit with them, and you break bread with them and that kind of thing. But the people that I remember are like Wilson Brown and McCrae, and people that like Wilson Brown and McCrae were running the printing press, and they were doing Willie McCrae. They were doing they were doing the support functions in the office, as I was when I first came. Of course, I was a support person, so you build these friendships and have these conversations about. I don't know. It's an interesting thing reflecting back. We didn't really have conversations too much about how we grew up or what we were doing before we got there. I guess we kind of talked about the work and what was happening in the field. Every morning, someone would call all the SNCC projects, because we had a Watts line, a wide area telephone line, and it was kind of like an 800 number of today. So we would document every morning and every evening. We would call all the projects and find out what had been going on. And then another thing we had to do, because we had this Watts line, we paid, I don't know, $400 a month or something like that. Maybe it wasn't that much. To have it, then the projects would call us collect. And we would say somebody from Greenwood would call, and they would say, this is Stokely Carmichael, and I want to talk to Jim Foreman. And we would say, well, Jim Foreman's not here, so can we take you used to leave an operator number, so operator 54 in Greenwood, so you could call back and get so we would just know that it was Stokely on the other end, and then we would dial using the 800 number, we would dial the SNCC office number and talk to Stokely or whoever it was that had called. So that was the way we we avoided the phone company charges, right? So I'm ready.
Where did you live when you moved to Atlanta?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. But we do have to go back and do Southern Student Freedom Fund.
Okay. All right, why don't you tell us about what the Southern Student Freedom Fund was?
Okay. Okay, so the Southern Student Freedom Fund was organized by NSA, Young Christian Students, SDS, and one other organization, Northern Student Movement. So it was four organizations of students, and NSA was part of it too. I don't know if I said that.
I think you did.
Yeah, okay. So those four organizations organized nationally on campuses to do support work for the Southern Freedom Movement.
And if I remember correctly, I think their first impetus was to raise money for scholarships for students who were kicked out of school because of the
Yes,
sit-ins.
yes. And then there would have been money raised for bail, and there would have been money raised just to send to SNCC directly for organizing, for field secretaries and that kind of thing, yeah.
And was there anything particular you wanted to say about their role or your connection?
Well, no, that I think Tim was very active in that. Tim Jenkins was active in the Southern Student Freedom Fund. There was a young man from New Orleans, I think his name was Walter Williams, maybe, who was the...
Jackson State student?
He might have been the Jackson State student or two who was kicked out, right? Who then became the coordinator of the Southern Student Freedom Fund. So again, it was another constellation of student energy that was developed, and where Black students played a really critical role in moving the work forward, in traveling nationally, in calling people in to do the work.
So that, I want to come back to your living situation in Atlanta. But
Yes.
before we do, is there a sense in these networks that you're participating in that Black students are sort of the driving force?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this is definitely a movement that is led by Black students. And we are, all of us are, first of all, exhilarated by the leadership of Black students, the vision, the clarity, the dedication, and the understanding of the need to fight against racial oppression. And then because these amazing Black students are leading it and in the trenches and sacrificing their lives in a way that we aren't sacrificing our lives. I mean, one of the privileges I had, of course, was when I went south to SNCC, I could leave. You know, I was a Northerner. I had a college degree. I certainly had a privilege to go back to, not that I did, but, to go back to kind of a professional or a middle-class existence. And a lot of the Black students had dropped out of college or been expelled from college, and they were first in their families to go to college, and so their families' hopes were riding on their success, and so they had to fly in the face of their families' expectations of what they would do with their lives.
Which reminds me, sort of, how was your family reacting?
Oh my gosh, they were outraged. They did not want me in the South. They thought I was duped. They thought I was, I don't know, they thought I was crazy. I mean, they were always, leaning on me to come home, get out of there. They really did think I was brainwashed and that I was under the grip of some sinister ideological thing. I don't know whether they thought something was planted in my brain and that was making me do these crazy things, but they were not happy at all. Not happy.
What about your brother?
I don't remember him having much, I don't remember him saying much in those days. I know that in retrospect, he's very proud of the work that I did, and he was very supportive later on, and he's a good thinker, progressive thinker himself. So, yeah, so he was supportive, and he was never,
I can't remember the details now, but I've seen a letter that Judy Richardson wrote to your mother.
Yes, yes, I know, thanking her. What they did when I was in Mississippi, that was the intense part, that they thought that was the duping, brainwashing, and so on. I think when I was active in raising money and that kind of thing, they didn't have too two thoughts about that because I was in Berkeley, I was safe, I wasn't in the South. So March of 64, I go south, but then the summer in June, I go to Greenwood. That's when the heat was put on. So the brainwashing, the duping, they're going to deprogram me when I come home. All that stuff happens in the summer of 64. But at the same time, they send us an air conditioner because they find out that we're living in 90-degree, 100-degree heat. So they send us an air conditioner for the office. So that's kind of the contradiction of the parent who's anxious about their child's existence and their political thinking, but that at the same time you want their kid to be comfortable, right? So it's so bizarre. It's so upper middle class. It's ridiculous. Anyway, so they send us an air conditioner, and Judy writes them a letter. Judy Richardson writes them a letter thanking them for the air conditioner.
Did they have? I mean, obviously they think you're crazy to go to Mississippi. What were their political views on segregation and the movement in general at this point?
Well, I think because of my mother's prejudices, that she's probably, I don't really know because I didn't have much connection with them. So I don't really know as the movement evolves and as more and more images are shown on TV. But I'm sure because of her prejudices, she's not thinking freedom movement, liberation. She's not thinking the things I'm thinking about why the movement's important. So
you started to describe your living situation in Atlanta.
In Atlanta.
From Berkeley.
So I live out, I can't remember the name of the street, but it's way out and it's kind of a freedom house. There's 5 or 10 people living in the apartment, and every morning we come into the office on Raymond Street, and then every evening we go out. We don't have transportation or cars, so you got to worry. You have to leave when somebody who has a car is leaving, or cop a ride with somebody who has a car, type of thing. And then I think I lived there for, did I live there until, I may have lived there, I don't remember. But then maybe I moved somewhere else to an apartment. And then after the summer of 64, I lived in a house on West Anthony Street with Joyce Brown, Carol Merritt, and one other woman. Joyce Brown, Carol Merritt, myself, and one other woman. All 3 were African-American women. And we had a nice little house with 4 bedrooms. And
I'm trying to think of what other African-American women would have been in the Atlanta office then.
Just trying to think.
Breaker?
I don't think it was Jeannie Breaker. Gosh. Oh, it was Shirley Cooks.
Oh.
Yeah, that's who it was.
Before we talk about that situation, was the Freedom House that you first moved into, is that a multiracial group?
It is, and it's an apartment in an apartment complex, and I can't remember the name of the street, but it's kind of far out, so yeah.
Because I know some of the white women who first moved to Atlanta, one of the things that they're struggling with is that Atlanta's so segregated that some of them initially are living in a white world.
In a white world, yeah.
And then others make a move into a black world where they end up being, I think, more comfortable. But I sort of was wondering about that because you've got SNCC is trying to deal with an integrated.
Exactly.
SNCC is integrated
exactly.
in a world that's still
segregated. Exactly. So the place that I lived out this highway, and I want to say, I can't remember the name of the highway. Anyway, that was not only multiracial, it was multigender. So I don't think it was just women. So, and I don't remember, I think I didn't stay there that long. And then I think I moved in with Dinky maybe. I think it was on English Avenue, but I'm not positive about that either. But I can remember walking from that apartment. First, when you lived out this faraway highway, you had to get a ride or be driven, or maybe we could take a bus in the morning. in the daytime. But that was definitely a black apartment complex. And then this other apartment that I lived in was close enough to the office that I could walk, because I remember walking down Raymond Street to the office every morning. So I'm not quite sure what that situation was.
Do you remember whether you paid the rent or whether SNCC paid the rent?
I think SNCC paid the rent on those places, those early places, up to summer of '64. And then fall of '64, when we moved to West Anthony Street, I think we paid the rent. Yeah. And it was reasonable. I mean, the SNCC, this is an interesting piece. I'm sure other SNCC folks have talked about this. The pay that we received was $10 a week, or $9.64 after taxes. And basically, when you were in the field, you had a free place, quotes around free, you had a free place to stay, either a Freedom House or with a family. So the $9.64 was kind of your subsistence. So you used it to buy groceries, or you used it to buy cigarettes, which most of us smoked in the day. Cigarettes were only 20 cents a pack or 15 cents a pack in that day. So, you could buy your cigarettes on that. It is a lot of cigarettes, right? When I quit smoking in 1969, a carton was $2.10. So I can remember the sign on T Street in Washington, D.C., cartons $2.10. So, so it was pretty accessible, that smoking. But anyway, so I think SNCC, in some cases, SNCC paid the rent, in some cases, we paid the rent. And then when you lived in Atlanta, your pay was $40 a week, and that was to acknowledge the fact that you had to pay rent. You had to pay utilities and that kind of thing.
Yeah, there are interesting discussions in some of the SNCC minutes about pay.
I'm sure, yeah.
Thing. So what was your work as Northern coordinator?
Okay, well, so it depended upon, so there were number of pieces to it. One was writing thank you letters to the people that sent us money. And often we received money unsolicited. People would send a check for $10 or $100 or $1,000 or 50 cents, So we would write a handwritten thank you note to everybody. Another part of the work was coordinating the Friends of SNCC activities. So not only did we call all of the projects every morning, we called all the Friends of SNCC offices every day. And we would give them a report on what had happened in Macomb, what had happened in Greenwood, what had happened in Albany, what had happened in Selma. And then we would, if we had some kind of a request, like call the newspapers or call your congressman or call the White House or call the Justice Department or call the FBI, or have a rally at such office, have a rally at a federal building to highlight these issues. And so people would organize things and go with their picket signs and their message. I mean, it's so interesting of today. There's all this science of how do you develop the message in organizing and how do you change the narrative and that kind of thing. We had no science behind any of that. We were out there with our messages, stop this from happening, stop the brutality in Greenwood, or release the people who are in Parchman Penitentiary. So, but we had no conversations about what was the way to play it with the media and how could we get favor for our cause, because we were just out there assuming that people were going to resonate with the issues and get involved.
Before you added that last bit, I was going to ask, is that because you thought that the message itself, that the issue was so self-evident?
Absolutely. And the news coverage was different at the time, because you would have these fabulous reporters, both TV and newspaper reporters, who were writing and capturing the images. I mean, I guess the TV images were not that well developed until a little later, but certainly Claude Sitton from the New York Times and some of the other writers were just incredible at capturing the spirit and the energy and the issues, the legal and the constitutional and the political issues.
So I think one of the things that hasn't been written that much about is what SNCC does accomplish through its Atlanta office, sort of through the bureaucracy.
Right,
That's the
right.
word, but
Right, well, that was
but-
the tendency to think of us as that, yeah.
yeah. Well, what are the kinds of work that's taking place in the Atlanta office when you get there in March '64?
So part of the work is because we're raising the money, we're also giving the money, we're paying the payroll, and we're giving the money to projects for when I say project, I mean a particular office in a community. So there was the Greenwood Project or the Macomb Project or the Hattiesburg office. So we would be giving money, distributing money to those offices. We would be collecting all the information and documenting all the information, and then using that information either for lawsuits, for sending to the Justice Department, for scholars, for newspaper writers, for whoever. In other words, we were documenting the daily atrocities, the daily insults, the daily brutality of each community in the South. And then we were also working with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, with SCLC, with the Congress of Racial Equality, with the National Lawyers Guild, with the Medical Committee for Human Rights. So we were working with these national organizations, with a lot of the church organizations, even National Council of Churches, or the Unitarians, or the Episcopalians, or the UCC, the United Church of Christ folks. We would be working, coordinating with them to think about what their role might be, how they might make a contribution, that kind of thing. So, and there were delegations that came south and that would do some learning. So there were a lot of different moving pieces. There was supporting the field projects, and the field organizing was the dominant one. And then the information that we sent to the Northern Friends of SNCC offices documented what was going on, and then if there was a theme to what we were trying to take care of at that particular point in time. It might have been something like the agriculture, the ASCS, the Agricultural Stabilization Conservation Service. So the ASCS was a federal program that enabled farmers to get some subsidies for either growing a certain thing or not growing a certain thing, but it was the white farmers who benefited from that program and not the black farmers. So there was a struggle to have the black farmers included in the benefits of that program. There were food stamp programs. There were all of these federal programs, including the school desegregation ruling by the Congress, that you had a fight to make the promise of the piece of legislation actually given some benefit to the African American communities.
And that's the Civil Rights Act of '64, which put a little teeth into school desegregation.
I think it's 63. Is it 63 maybe that does it? No, it's 64. Okay, you're the scholar. I'm just the person in the trenches, right? Yeah, so 64.
You're just doing the work.
Yes, right. So actually, yes, 64. That makes sense. So 65 is the key voting rights, the Civil Rights Act. Yeah, so 64, each school district was required to have a plan for desegregating. And of course, many school districts in the South formed their own white-only private school system. So, but if you didn't do that, you were supposed to have a plan where you could have freedom of choice, which of course put the burden on the black family that was wanting better education for their kids, so they had to undergo all the harassment and the attacks because they made the choice to send their child to the black school, or you would have some districts, very few districts had all the first graders got put together, all the second graders, or maybe the first, second, and third graders got put together across racial lines, and then it would continue on up. So, but that was very seldom. It was mostly freedom of choice, and that meant that it wasn't free choice, basically.
I want to come back to that because I think you did a lot of work on
I did.
school stuff.
I did.
Do a few other things first,
Okay.
if it's
Okay.
When you come to the Atlanta office and you're working, is there already a print shop?
I think there is. Yeah, there's a print shop, and we are doing, yes, we're doing publications. We're doing, and clearly we're doing the mimeographing, but there is some kind of a printing press. So there's Mark Suckle, there's Wilson Brown, Willie McRae, what's this other guy's name? Forgetting his name. But, you know, there were some hard-working folks who were, you know, doing the printing. Walter Tillow, I don't know if he was in the printing press or, so anyway.
And one of the things I've seen is that SNCC takes these newspaper articles and then sort of lays them out with pictures.
Yes.
And has the fundraising appeal.
Exactly,
And then
exactly.
The student voice.
The Student Voice was the publication, and that was printed on the printing press. So you could print an 11 by 17 piece of paper, and it looked pretty nice. I don't know what the printing method was at the time, but it was better than a mimeograph thing, because you could have the pictures, exactly.
Are you doing, when those things are printed, these things are printed up, do you have to like fold them and stuff?
Absolutely. Oh, yes, I'm so glad you remember. We had so many envelope stuffing parties and folding parties, because we don't, folding machine or automated fundraising? No. So yes, we're up late at night folding and stuffing and, you know, talking and having pizza and playing music and cutting up and that type of thing. So that was part of...
Your sort of college student party, college age parties.
Exactly, with the envelope stuffing and so on. And of course, everybody knew that the fundraising was critical to the success of the organization. And so this was something we had to do, right? So there would be a fundraising appeal. That was something that we did in my department, was write the letter. And one of the things that we stayed away from was oh, you have to help the poor Mississippi person who has no rights. We were more, this is a democratic country. We need to be committed and dedicated to our ideals. This is an egregious violation of democratic principles, and we need to, I mean, we didn't use egregious and those words in the fundraising appeal, but you know, that was the idea, was that we're not being true to our better side, and therefore we have to, and here are these courageous young people who are risking their lives and taking a step way beyond their comfort zone or anybody's comfort zone to bring the promise of democracy to the South. Of course, it was all about the South. We had no real lens on what the inequities in the North were, and what the structural, certainly not understanding what the structural inequities were that were going on at the same time in terms of jobs and housing and education in the North.
So I know that some of the SNCC women had a sit-in in January of 1964.
Yes,
and
yes.
You get slightly different stories depending on who you ask.
Yes.
But when you came in and started working, did you have any awareness of that?
Not really. I don't think I only knew that in retrospect when we were working on the Hands on the Freedom Plow book, and of course Judy Richardson has it in her story, and you know, other people referred to it. So yeah.
Can you hold up Hands on the Freedom
Of
Plow?
course.
Tell us briefly what that is.
Briefly. Okay.
Well, we're going to come back.
Yes. Okay. So briefly, this is 52 stories of women who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it came out in 2010.
And who edited it?
So there were 6 of us who edited it: Judy Richardson, Dottie Zellner, Faith Holsart, Martha Prescott Norman, and Jean Smith Young, and myself.
And you're all SNCC women.
We were all SNCC women. Yes, it took us 15 years to get this out into the public.
And we all thank you for doing it.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It was a labor of love.
You want to say?
Okay.
What was it like to go into Mississippi in summer '64? You come in. Actually, before I ask that.
Okay.
When you were recruited, you were obviously recruited to come work in the Atlanta office.
Absolutely.
On your own, did you have any desire to go in the field?
Absolutely. Oh, yes. Of course, you want to go into the field. I mean, I was torn. You know, I felt safe in the office. I felt this parent thing that I was dealing with, right, where they were putting all this pressure on me to not be there. So I felt I could carve out a space in the office. I was competent. I knew the work. I could do it. You know, I was pretty efficient. I was pretty effective. But I wanted to be in the field. I was thrilled to go to Mississippi for the summer of '64, to be in the Greenwood office. And even though I was in the office then, I remember asking people, I want to go canvassing with you. I want to go out. And I did go canvassing with Peter Orris a couple times, who was one of the white summer volunteers, who's now in Chicago. He became a physician, actually, in Chicago, and has worked for many years in, health access and health equity organizing efforts as a doctor. But anyway, I went out canvassing with him a couple times to ask people to register to vote. I wanted to get the essence of the work. I wanted to be part of that essence. So in fact, in the fall of '65, after I had been the Northern Coordinator for a year, I decided I didn't want to do the Northern Coordinating anymore, but I wanted to do what was called federal programs. So federal programs had to do with what we talked about before, about the discriminatory application of all the federal benefits in the South. And somebody had been doing this work. I can't remember if somebody had been doing it or if it had just been done in Mississippi. And so I imagined that I could do this by traveling to the different projects and documenting the inequalities of the giving out of the federal benefits. And then I would also go to Washington and do some research on the actual working of the program. So it was food stamps, it was the school desegregation stuff, it was the ASCS, the Agricultural Stabilization Conservation Service, and other kind of local things. So I did go to Arkansas. I went to both the projects in Little Rock and Pine Bluff, and I interviewed people and documented, we used to take affidavits, which would be sworn statements about the discriminatory practices or the impact of these practices on the community. So that was one thing I did. And then when I got to Washington, maybe the second time I got to Washington, there was this issue with the school, the Civil Rights Act of '64 summer. I think the Congress had to write some rules for how would the school districts go about desegregating. And so the rules maybe had been written by then, and then there were all of these questions about how was the act being put into practice. And so Marion Berry, who was the head of the Washington, D.C. office at the time, and I went to the Office of Education, and we asked if we could see their files, and they let us see their files. And in their files, we found these incredible pieces of information about the dispensations that were being given. A congressman would write to the Office of Education. He would say, well, in my school district in Hattiesburg, we are not ready to desegregate, and therefore we're okay with a freedom of choice plan for the first grade type of thing. So they were like the minimum step forward is what they were willing. And then the Office of Education would write back and they would say, oh, that's okay. You're relieved of any burden of responsibility. So what we did is we documented all of that. We put it together in a report, which we published. It was mimeographed, because I remember what it looked like. And we had a big press conference in November, I think, of '65, maybe, where John Lewis came, and we presented this data to the press. Now, what impact it had, I guess we never figured out, whether the report itself, but it's like a lot of different iterations today. Somebody will do a report about, access to jobs being inequitable, or they'll do affordable housing or whatever. So you make a big fanfare, you present it to the press writes about it, and then it's available for other scholars and researchers and congressmen and lawmakers who will then go on to write a different piece of legislation that takes into account what the findings have been. So
I want to circle back to a couple of the things that you talked about.
Okay.
But I think one thing that people might find useful, I think what the Civil Rights Act did was it gave the federal government the power to withdraw federal funding from
Exactly.
schools if they didn't have
Exactly. That was the point. If they didn't have the plan, and then the Office of Education would say, okay, your plan's fine, you keep the federal money, right?
And so there's this period of negotiation negotiation on what they had to do to
Exactly.
fulfill that, and it kind of became a little stronger
Yes.
over time as
Yes.
the resistance that you described.
Yeah. And also the organizing in the South. I mean, we can't forget that, because there were people in communities who were enrolling their children in the white school and who were being thrown off the plantation, who were being kicked out of their jobs, who were being harassed, houses were being shot into. So it was part of the organizing picture. It became part of the next iteration of demands beyond voting rights. It was the demand to have access to the federal programs. It was the demand for equal education, et cetera. So,
A lot of people see Freedom Summer and the MFDP Challenge as kind of a high point, and that there's and people feel like there's a real drop off
after that,
the MFDP Challenge. And my sense is, from reading your piece in Hands on the Freedom Plow, that that wasn't your experience.
well, I think what it did, the fact that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation was not accepted wholeheartedly by the National Democratic Party, what that did for us was kind of was a slap in the face. It was like, oh, no matter what the picture is that we've painted of the denial of voting rights to people in the South, and especially within the party structure in this case, they are not going to pay attention to that, because they're more interested in their own political. Johnson was certainly interested in getting elected as president, and he wasn't going to compromise the support of the southern states, all of that. So for us, it was a rethinking, for us in SNCC, it was a rethinking of what the heck are we doing, or what's the next step. Do we, as Foreman put forward, do we have a Black Belt summer project the next summer, and we go into Alabama and Arkansas and Georgia, and so we've spread across the South. South Carolina was part of that too, and Jack Minnis in the research department had done all the research to show all the denial of voting rights across all those black counties, the Black Belt counties across the South. Do we do that? Which some people that's more of the same, right? Do we continue the local organizing? Does it become more about schools and about access to benefits and food stamps and that kind of thing? Do we continue the voting rights conversation? And so we continue all of that. And in fact, we never resolved the Black Belt Summer Project issue. More students do come south in the summer of '65 to Mississippi. Not that many, but some. We have all these soul-searching conversations in the SNCC meetings that year. We have 4 SNCC meetings that year, 2 in the fall maybe, and 2 in the spring. And we debate and discuss the direction of the movement, and we talk about all the themes were there. I mean, I won't go in. I'm sure somebody's interview will be able to elucidate all these points. But we really do a lot of soul searching, and we as young people we try to pay attention to all of the organizational development issues, like the personnel issues. How are people working? Are people absent? Are people like burned out, and are they therefore not working and we're still sending them a paycheck? Or are people, how are the different projects working? And so we were paying attention to that. And then of course Selma happened, which is in March of '65. And then we're pushing back a little bit about that, because we're like not in favor of Dr. King plunking himself into a community and kind of pushing for something big, but not building the capacity in the local community, not developing leadership, not going at the pace that the local community wants to go at. Of course, the story is that Amelia Boynton, who was the leader of the Dallas County Voters League, she wanted Dr. King to come in because she thought things were not moving quickly enough. The SNCC field secretaries were building that capacity and leadership within the community. And I think they felt that Dr. King coming in was a diversion from that. Of course, the SNCC field secretaries supported the Selma to Montgomery March. And then, the rest is documented history. I won't go into that. So I was only in Atlanta when the attack on the Edmund Pettus Bridge happened. And then we were able, this is amazing, we were able to charter a plane to send 4 people, Ivanhoe Donaldson, Cortland Cox, and Prathia Hall, and I don't know who the 4th person was, to Selma from Atlanta to get, so they could get there quickly to be kind of the backup SNCC support for John Lewis and John Love, who was the field secretary in the community. So yeah, that was kind of amazing.
It is sort of amazing.
Yeah.
Some of the stories of planes too, walking out on the runway.
Yeah, exactly. The other piece was the cars, the fact that we had a fleet of 40 cars called the Sojourner Motor Fleet. Sojourner Motor Fleet. And who knows where that money came from? I mean, I suspect it might have come from Harry Belafonte, or who knows, but there was, actually maybe it was 20 cars. Was it 40 cars or 20 cars? But anyway, we got a chunk of money from some source. Belafonte was one of SNCC's big benefactors. Also, SCLC got a lot of money from him. But we were able to buy a fleet of cars, very low-end Fords, and put CB radios in them so that people could communicate in dangerous, especially in dangerous areas. So each project was assigned a car, and that was amazing.
I know one of the pieces of that is that they were able to buy the cars, SNCC was able to buy the cars at cost, at the price that
the dealer's price.
workers.
Oh, because of the United Auto Workers. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that part, right?
Yeah, so they didn't buy them at sticker price.
Yeah,
they bought
yeah.
them at the,
One of the histories that has never been really written is this history of money flows. Like, what were the resources that either SCLC, SNCC, NAACP had or CORE had at their disposal? How did they get it? Where did they get it from? That kind of thing. I know in SNCC there was a big debate at one point about the focus on voting rights as opposed to direct action, because the big foundations were ready to give money through the voter education project. And within SNCC, everybody thought, oh my gosh, this is going to soften the movement. It's going to dampen the organizing. It's going to divert people's attention. And so Miss Baker was the one who suggested that SNCC do both the direct action as well as the voting rights organizing. And then, of course, the voting rights organizing turned out to be direct action because of the resistance from the Southerners. So,
yeah, that was the Kennedys thought that if they
yes, exactly. They thought that they could.
miscalculated.
They definitely did. They had no idea, right?
You mentioned a little bit ago moving from the position of Northern Coordinator to working with federal programs.
Yes.
With something like that, so you saw a need for a different kind of work, or you had. So do you just propose and say, hey, I want to do this, and then you make that move? How did something like that happen?
Well, I proposed it, and then I got agreement. I mean, I guess I proposed it to the executive committee. I'm not quite sure whether that's what I did. And then, then I think what happens, so I get the approval to do this federal programs work. I don't think I had much guidance, and I don't think, and it was, it was part of the more loose structure of SNCC, which enabled people to carve out a space for themselves if they thought, oh, here's a space I can do, and you would normally get approval to do it. It on some level, it had to do with white privilege, though, I think, because as a white staff person, as somebody who had these, and it wasn't that it was a SNCC strategy to go after the documenting of the federal programs. There was a strategy to do the congressional challenge at the time, post 64 convention, and there were some other efforts where Mississippians went to Washington to protest and met with the federal agencies. I think that's kind of where I got the idea from. That was in that was in January of 65. I think people went to DC and met with all these federal agencies about the way the programs were being delivered in the South. And anyway, so I had a certain level of privilege. I had that education privilege and the white privilege. I had a car at that point. Was also partly my parents' able to, fund a car. It wasn't a new car, but it was, it got me from place to place. So there was a level of privilege there, and there was also a level of the freedom within SNCC to kind of figure out what you could do within what you were interested in that would also dovetail with the fight for freedom. So,
And I know that happens in the context, as you've said, SNCC's doing all this soul searching.
Yes,
and then there
exactly.
And one of the big debates going on is what should the structure of SNCC look like?
Exactly.
How structured versus how
or non-structured, right?
it?
And I was in the structure faction, interestingly enough, right? That we needed a strong central structure partly because I had heard from all the field staff that they needed some regularity to the way they were funded, and that there was a real anger that Mississippi was getting all this attention and money, and they in Georgia, in Alabama, and Arkansas, they were feeling like they were stepchildren of the organization and weren't being funded at the same level. And because all the volunteers flooded into Mississippi, then those volunteers had access to money, and they went back home and they raised money for the project that they had been part of. So they would send it to Macomb, or they would send it to Itabena, or they would send it to Greenville, or wherever they had been stationed, or Indianola, or Ruleville, or whatever. So those, I don't know which, and again, this story has never been written about how those funding inequities played out within the organization, how people coped with that, and or how comfortable people felt with that. So.
One of the SNCC meetings that's sort of infamous is the Waveland meeting.
There were two Waveland meetings. So are you talking about fall of 65 or spring of 66?
It was actually fall 64.
Oh, fall, yes, of course, fall 64, yes. Yes, well, that was the meeting where all the papers were written and presented. So there were papers on every topic, on the people, on the there was a kind of a tension around the level of education that people had, and whether people from the field, not the field secretaries, but the sharecroppers that we were working with, how key was their voice, and how much how important it was to have respect for them. So there was that whole question of education and wisdom. And, clearly a lot of SNCC staff felt there was incredible wisdom in the local people. I felt that clearly. I mean, they could just take an issue and kind of, crystallize it in a very plain, simple language and move people to action, So there were papers about structure, there were papers about culture and creativity, there were papers about, oh my goodness, about things like the Freedom Democratic Party or some kind of electoral campaigns. There were papers on everything, and everybody was encouraged to write a paper if they wanted to. And so that was all put into the mix and the discussion. So.
And one of the papers that's gotten a lot of attention over the years is the position paper
on women.
In the
Exactly.
Organization. It was published anonymously.
Exactly.
But very quickly identified with Mary King and Casey Hayden. I know you know about that, but were you aware of it at the time?
I don't think so. I don't think, I mean, I'm pretty sure that they may have given it to me or shown it to me, but I wasn't in that space at that time at all. I wasn't in the women's liberation space until the early 70s. And there's, a whole history to that. But yeah, I wasn't in that space. So if they did show it to me and asked me to be what I thought or to be part of it, I was not interested. And I don't actually remember the debate happening at the Waveland meeting. So I don't know whether I wasn't there or whether it's just something that I wasn't interested in. I don't really remember. I mean, I think it's partly the background is that I felt so respected and so free to be in the moment, to be in the struggle, to make a contribution, that I didn't see this discriminatory, making women to be felt less than. In fact, even though I come out of a tradition where women are not respected and honored and whatever. But I felt that SNCC did give me that affirmation, and so I didn't need to fight for women's liberation per se. And because I think also I felt the freedom struggle was paramount. And so it's interesting. At some point I want to go back and read all of the discussions about the women's movement during the abolitionist time and find out what the different women's positions were on why they did or didn't join the separate women's organizations, or why they felt that their struggle should be subservient to the Black freedom struggle. Because that's kind of how I felt, I think. And again, looking back, I can see that the struggle of Black women was clearly should have been lifted up more than it was, or could have been. I mean, certainly the position of Black women was much more challenging than that of Black men. But and then the white women's movement left Black women out of their equation for many decades. In fact, probably still does on some level. But somehow, I guess I thought that the Black struggle was the dominant struggle, and therefore I was not going to be diverted by this women's liberation thing, right? And I don't know if it was because I thought somebody would call me a traitor, or they would, it was too self-centered, or I don't remember what it was, or why it was. Okay. Okay.
I think you've probably already answered this, but I know Mary King and Casey Hayden talk about, sharing books about, women's issues. And having these discussions, and it sounds a little bit like what you were doing in graduate school.
Exactly.
Social movements.
Yeah.
Do you remember that part of that network at all?
I wasn't. I don't remember. I mean, like the Simone de Beauvoir and the Doris Lessing books. I remember reading Doris Lessing later, once I was in D.C., but I wasn't part of that. I was just in the trenches doing the work. Whatever had to stuff in the envelopes, writing the stuff to be sent out to raise the money, right? I was just so focused on all of that.
So you mentioned that you and Marion Barry were looking at the education materials when you wrote that report. I know SNCC opens a DC office initially as a support office and in general, and then there was the DC MFDP office.
Exactly.
And part of that is connected to the strong Howard University Nonviolent Action Group, or
NAG, yes.
But at a certain point, SNCC starts moving towards working in DC, organizing DC in its own right.
Yes.
Can you talk about that, or do you have a sense
A little
of that?
bit. Well, a little bit. I mean, I think it mostly happened after I left, but at some point I make this transition from the federal programs person to working full-time in the DC office. I'm not quite sure if that happens in November or December. I have an apartment in DC by then. I guess I'm just full-time DC office. So
Sorry to interrupt. When you first started working on federal programs, are you still based out of Atlanta?
Yes, I'm based out of Atlanta. I'm traveling to Arkansas, to Alabama. I never went to Southwest Georgia in that process. But, and then I go to DC, and I stay there was a Freedom House in Mount Pleasant in DC at the time, or somebody lived there. I just stayed there temporarily. But by December, I think I have an apartment in DC on California Street. And so
This would be like December 65?
65, yes. So I'm permanently a part of the Washington SNCC office. So in February of 65, there are two initiatives that happen. One is a Free DC movement, which has to do with the fact that the District of Columbia doesn't have voting representation in Congress. And so we have a logo that has a chain, and there are hands pulling the chain apart. It's Free DC is the logo. And a guy named L.D. Pratt comes from Kansas or Iowa or somewhere, an older white guy, and Marion and he become very chummy. And this kind of drives a wedge in the office too, because he's much older than all the rest of us, right? And Marion Barry, who's the head of the Washington SNCC office, he becomes very chummy with him. And so the staff, we're kind of feeling a little bit left out of the decision-making process. But one of the things that they concoct is an approach to big businesses, department stores, that kind of thing in DC, and ask them to put this logo in their window that says Free DC. And I forget if they were supposed to give some money or what they were supposed to do, but if you didn't put the logo in your window, then you were told, well, we were going to boycott you. Now, I don't think SNCC actually boycotted anybody. I don't remember, but I remember the big department stores, Woodward and Lothrop and Heck Company and so on, wore some of the targets to get this Free DC decal in the window. And I don't know if anybody's written this history up either. This would be interesting history, right? So, and Marion, of course, has passed away, so he can't share. There's a couple of people, Tina Smith, who's still in DC, who might have some of this history because she worked kind of as the administrator in the Washington office. And Eric Jones is somebody else who's a SNCC person who worked in the Washington office, who's still in DC, comes to the SNCC meetings and reunions. So anyway, that was one thrust. The other thrust was we did a bus boycott. And that would have been in February or March of '66.
And let me ask, so while you're doing these thrusts in DC, there must still be an MFDP office that's working on the congressional challenge? Because that was January
of '65, though, wasn't it?
Right.
So this is a year later. Right. I think the MFDP office maybe is closed. I don't really know at this point. In other words, Charlene Krantz could give you the dates of that. But Marion, so we start this bus boycott, and I think it was around bus fares. I think the issue was bus fares. And we had this very clever plan where we would give people rides to work, and we used Benning Road as the big thoroughfare that we concentrated on. And we had, in the basement of the SNCC office, which was on Rhode Island Avenue, we had this array of telephones that was supposed to take the incoming calls from people. And I think it only lasted a few days. I don't know if we even won the fare stabilization. It's very murky in my mind, but I do know that right after that I quit. I wrote a letter talking about how the internal culture in the SNCC office was not an atmosphere where people could be participatory, could participate in the decision-making process, which is what it had been, and that it was time for me to move on. So I did.
Can you talk about what the racial dynamics were in the organization? You come to SNCC in fall '64 in Atlanta.
In March of '64. That's okay, no problem.
March '64 in Atlanta, and at that point it's very much an interracial office.
Exactly. It's mostly African American though. It's never predominantly white.
Even in the Atlanta office?
Even in the Atlanta office, it's not predominantly white. If I ticked off the names of the people, it wouldn't be predominantly white. So yes, but it is an interracial office, and there are some situations where there are interracial relationships, and there are some living situations which are interracial, but there are also some situations where Black staff live together. And I don't remember if maybe it's the fall of '65. No, I'm sorry, the fall of '64, there are some parties which are Black-only parties. And I'm only vaguely aware. I'm kind of like one of these people who is not like totally tuned into all the different social dynamics. So I'm kind of only vaguely aware, and I'm not feeling like I'm left out. I'm not feeling that this is some horrible thing. You know, Black people want to have a party, you know. It's like, I'm not, so I'm not paying too much attention. I do know there was a lot of controversy around people who had interracial relationships, especially Foreman, who was in an interracial relationship and who had an African-American wife. So there was a lot of tension around that. I'm thinking that I'm becoming aware of the racism that I carry, the prejudice, the stuff, the stereotypes that I carry with me. But nobody is really there schooling me, as I think today there are a lot of white people who are able to school other white people on the nature of privilege, on the way we perpetrate microaggressions, the way that we are insensitive and don't understand. Like somebody told me a story last night about a church Sunday school where a woman was talking about planting flowers and taking a bulb and talking about how the bulb was brown and ugly. And this woman actually had 2 biracial daughters in the Sunday school class. And she was like, brown and ugly, are my kids gonna, be feeling less than since brown is associated with ugly? And so she will speak to that person, but the person probably had no clue, wasn't doing it for any malicious reason, but nobody schooled us on that stuff. Nobody talked to us about hair or about, about the stereotypes or the ways in which we were not appreciative of what the Black community was. And I worried for years that I was not appreciative of both the resources that I was able to. Like I stayed in somebody's house during the summer of '64 and I was given the only bedroom. I mean, what's that about? It's like, and I feel angry at myself for not being much more connected to that privilege and insisting that the couple move back into their own bedroom and I sleep on the couch. But that wasn't what they were imagining because they were welcoming us. So those kinds of things, I think there was just nobody that was schooling us on how to be and what the disconnect between our upbringing and the upbringing or the poverty of the South and the mores of the South. Nobody was able to guide us. I don't remember anybody guiding us. So, so I think the Black-only parties or the tensions were part of that. And of course, later on, I realized that part of that was that we were the closest as your consciousness about racial oppression, as a Black person, as your consciousness about racial oppression intensifies and you peel back the layers and you see what the incredible brutality is and the incredible denial of rights. We're the white people, we're the closest white people to them. So no wonder their anger and their fury is somehow directed at us, even though we're not the culprits, we're not the perpetrators of the oppression, but we're there, we're right there, we're the symbol of white supremacy within the SNCC organization. So, and in fact, in D.C., a kid, this was in '68, I think after Dr. King was killed, I'm walking down 18th Street and a Black kid comes up and hits me in the face and he says, "You dirty white lady," or something like that, right? And I'm like taken aback, but then I'm thinking, well, okay, this is part of what the color of racial oppression is like in the country. It's not, and I couldn't take it personally. I mean, I knew that I had, that I was playing a different role than the white oppressor, but it still stung, because I got a kid was pissed off at me, right? And so it pushes you into a space where you recognize what that white power, control, supremacy is all about. So.
You mentioned there was some tension around Foreman because you had a Black wife and he's in an interracial relationship.
Yes.
Do you have any sense of how much that's because, would the tension have been the same if he hadn't been married to a Black woman at the time?
It could have been. I mean, one of the things at Waveland, at one of the Waveland meetings, and I'm forgetting whether it was fall of '64 or spring of '65, there was a whole thing about backsliding. And it was Black men who had white partners or white relationships. Now, I was in a relationship with Marion Barry, so he was part of that conversation. Stokely, I think, had relationships with white women. So there were the whole conversation about these Black men who had white relationships or white maybe not partners in the traditional sense, because these relationships didn't last very long, right? Because we were young, so we went from one person to another. But there was lots of conversation about, and I think this is, again, as the nationalist movement was building and as the frustrations of the U.S. not changing, the country not changing, and of us being young and not understanding that the struggle was long and that it wasn't going to happen overnight. I mean, both black and white young people, we didn't get that. We thought we were like going to really transform the country, and boy, it didn't happen the way we imagined it. So,
what's your memory of when SNCC starts talking about whites working in the white community? How did you respond to that?
Well, I think that I probably was not. Well, okay, let me back up. I think that there was some talk about that certainly in Mississippi. There was some talk about going into the white community during the election in fall of '64 to kind of, I don't know whether we had Lyndon B. Johnson signs or what the deal. I didn't do it, but there were a number of white people who went into the white community, but who got pretty much harassed by the police, rejected by the local white population, kind of told to get out of town, you're a nigger lover type of thing. So that initiative was not didn't last very long. The other thing that was happening, there was a Southern Student Organizing Committee, or SOC, which was Southern white students who did go on white campuses to try to find sympathetic white students who would support the civil rights organizing or the freedom movement. So there was that. I think there were a bunch of reasons why we didn't go into the white community. One is because I don't think we felt any connection to the white working class folks that we might have been canvassing. And I guess we didn't imagine that we were going to be talking to white businessmen or white legislators or people like that. We imagined we would go door knocking in a neighborhood or canvassing in a neighborhood and would be working class folks. And we just felt here we were, middle class, Northerners, educated, right? So I think we didn't feel the connection. That was one. Another is that here we were in this incredible community of civil rights workers, and we felt very passionate about our community, very close to everybody, very like we had died and gone to heaven because we were in this incredible community of struggle and of change and of power, because it was a very powerful community in the sense that we were our mission was to transform the country, to make it the country that we had been taught that it was, the kind of country we had been taught it was when we were kids, And that was separate from anybody of color. That was like, these are the ideals of the country: democracy, freedom, etc. So that was another reason we felt close to this community. Another reason, I think, is we didn't think politically we were going to change these folks. I think we didn't understand how we could change. So we imagined it was the Klan and us, So it was white people were in the Klan, or they were Klan sympathizers, and us. And so we didn't, again, go into the white community. There was never any conversation also of, when we went back home, going into the white community at home and getting people to be more committed. We did say, yes, organize money when you go back home and organize at federal buildings and that kind of thing. But there was never any thinking about intentionally going into the white community to winning people over who were not in that space of being supportive of the freedom movement. Now today, one of the things I'm involved in is Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is a national organization of white people calling white people into a multiracial America, calling white people in to stand for racial justice. And it feels like I'm fulfilling that SNCC promise of go into the white community and organize by being connected to this amazing national network of white people who are working in the white community, calling people in to work for racial justice, calling people in to understand the inequities, the inequitable structures in the country, to understand white privilege in a way that white people mostly don't think about it or talk about it. And it's very, very exciting, I think.
What's the connection between that and the Black Lives Matter?
Well, okay, so Showing Up for Racial Justice was formed in 2009 when the attacks began on Obama. And a number of people of color-led organizations said, well, where are the white people standing up against these attacks? And I think for white progressives, maybe we weren't totally in love with Obama. We didn't really, we didn't buy the yes, we can, the deeper aspects that we wanted out of yes, we can. So anyway, a lot of these white folks who had been doing anti-racist organizing and training and work said, oh yeah, good point. We got to stand up against this. And so the first organization was called U.S. No Room for Racism, the U.S. for All of Us is what it was called. And there were, I won't go into the whole history, but that's a whole other set of interviews for somebody to do at some point. But by the time that Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, there was a lot of work had been done about how do we dismantle white supremacy structures, what does it mean? And so there was a toolkit that was done, put online on Showing Up for Racial Justice's page about how to organize around the murder of Trayvon Martin and what were the themes, what were the things that people could be doing, what action they could be taken. And then when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson in August of 2014, the chapter structure just began to mushroom. So that was kind of the inception of it. But then because the Black Lives Matter movement propelled people's thinking and consciousness much further forward. And I think the Michelle Alexander work around the new Jim Crow and the impact of the criminal justice system, the mass incarceration, and the over-policing in Black communities, all that understanding, which was done by some amazing scholars and then popularized around the country, and then the murders that were lifted up by cell phone video, et cetera, then the Showing Up for Racial Justice nationally works with the Black Lives Matter movement. They have accountability relationships. And so one of the things about SURGE, that's the nickname for Showing Up for Racial Justice, is to work in conjunction with Black Lives Matter organizations, with local Black-led and people of color-led organizations that are putting forward the vision for how we move to a more equitable structures and how we change the country. So,
what is some of the work you've been doing with SURGE here in Baltimore?
Well, in April, when the Baltimore uprising happened, I was asked by the national coordinator of SURGE, who actually is somebody I had known from my organizing days in the 90s and the 2000s. She called me and she asked if I could find some people who would talk about the Baltimore background. So I got two women of color who spoke on a conference call of 700 people just after the uprising, right, about the Baltimore background, what led to it, what the circumstances were. And then in that call was the time where the St. Louis people had been doing door knocking with Black Lives Matter signs, and then the people in Arizona had been doing door knocking with signs saying no on SB 1070, which was the law that criminalized immigrants that Sheriff Arpaio had been doing in Arizona. So, I mean, he shackled immigrants and brought them to the public square in Phoenix like they were just common criminals, shackled them and had them walking around in like orange jumpsuits. I mean, the images are just incredible. This is pre-Trump, right? I mean, this is, but anyway, so, I lost my train of thought. Oh, so that we learned about the door knocking that had happened in St. Louis and that had happened in Arizona on that call. And then the charge was take a selfie of yourself saying, I support the Baltimore uprising, or with the hashtag Baltimore uprising, which is a Twitter handle, I guess. I'm not on Twitter. And then go out and door knock with Black Lives Matter signs, talk to people, go into white neighborhoods and talk to people about structural inequity and about racism and police brutality and that kind of thing. So I got an organization that I was in locally called Baltimore Racial Justice Action to agree to do the door knocking with the signs. And you see the sign in my yard. And I have a sign here if you want to take a picture of it later. So we did that, we did the door knocking, and then I was asked by Showing Up for Racial Justice if I wanted to become a regional resource person. And I agreed, and so I went to Highlander in August, which was very exciting because I had never been in Highlander Education Center. I never went there during the Civil Rights Movement because I wasn't important enough to go there, right? So,
for people who don't know Highlander, can you say something about their role in the movement?
Sure. So, yes, so they actually began in the 30s, and they began with tobacco workers and textile workers, and they brought black and white workers together from the South to talk about their common purpose and their common struggle. And then when pre the sit-ins, I think they were already doing the Septima Clark, for example, and Rosa Parks went to Highlander to talk about citizen education and talk about organizing across the South. So they played a big role in bringing white and black activists together in the South. Miles Horton, who was the director of Highlander, did a lot of popular education teaching. So it was a way to go into areas where people were unorganized and use popular education techniques to have people discuss their situation, aka Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian popular educator, to do this process of consciousness raising. So Highlander was a kind of a core place. They got bombed. They had to move from where they were in Tennessee to another place because they were bombed, and their lease was taken from them. This is all in the either late 50s or early 60s. So they moved to, and now they're in a particular place where they own the land, and they're pretty stable.
I know they were shut down by the state of Tennessee and
yes.
charged with, illegal
sedition
alcohol.
and what? Oh, well, yeah.
But I didn't remember that they were bombed.
I think they were bombed. I might be wrong. I mean, you're the historian, Emily. So
I mean, I'm not saying
Right,
they
right.
weren't. I just don't remember.
right,
I was
right.
trying to
Yeah,
place it.
and maybe they weren't bombed. Maybe that's just my recollection of the way the Southern culture worked. That you bombed somebody if you weren't in favor of their work. So yeah.
So
Okay.
we jumped to your current work with Surge and
Yes.
here in Baltimore on racial justice. But can you talk about sort of
The intervening years,
yeah,
the 30,
what
the 40 years in between.
how
right,
being in
right.
SNCC affected you and,
Right,
and
right.
what you did leaving SNCC. You
Okay.
also mentioned being part of the women's movement at a certain point. Maybe
Yeah.
you could touch on that.
Okay, so when I left SNCC, I had moved to Washington. I stayed in Washington, and I worked in a Black community arts program for a number of years. And then I got involved in the anti-war movement, which was a big center was in D.C. So I reconnected with some of the SDS people and some of the people who'd been in Mississippi who were white, who were in the anti-war movement. So I did some anti-war organizing while I worked in this arts center. We did some organizing as white people around the rebellion after Dr. King's death. We did some taking supplies into the Black community, that kind of thing. We had an organization called The Emergency, which was white people talking about race and inequity. Then I got the women's movement reached me in the early 70s, so I was in a couple of consciousness raising groups. I didn't do a lot with the women's movement, but I kind of came to my own understanding about women's oppression and how it had affected me by being in connection with these amazing women in the liberation movement. Then
Did it change your sense of what you'd experienced in
SNCC.
in SNCC or SDS or any of the other work you'd done before?
It probably helped me center it. I mean, helped me realize but I think it didn't say to me, oh my God, you were really oppressed in SNCC, Betty. No, it didn't say to me that at all. It might have said, okay, I wonder why I didn't feel that oppression, because I was valued and affirmed and given opportunities that I never would have had otherwise, I mean, as Judy Richardson says, if you could do anything you were big enough to do, So if you took a step way out there and crafted some idea for what you could do, or if you if you thought of a new, like in my case, I was doing the Northern Support work, if I thought of some new initiative that I could do in that context, I could do it and be affirmed to doing it,
Sorry, you were going to
Yeah.
keep going. And
No, so then I moved, I mean, there were some other things that I did in there, but eventually I moved to Baltimore in 1972 to work in a factory. And that was part of young people across the country feeling that the country hadn't changed sufficiently enough. And so we went to work in factories to get the working class involved in some kind of, radical, transformative process for the U.S. So I worked in this factory for 8 years. I married a factory worker, a black factory worker. I left the factory when one of my daughters had a birth defect and I needed to not be fired from my job, but I got a fabulous job working for a doctor who was an occupational medicine doctor who got a grant from HRSA, which is it's a government agency, HRSA, HRSA, it's in Hyattsville. Anyway, he got a grant to teach medical students about occupational medicine. And part of it was taking medical students to factories, on factory tours. And so I did that for 3 years. I took medical students to all of the factories in Baltimore, to Bethlehem Steel, to the Chevrolet plant, to the glass plant where one of the places I had worked, to the Arco Steel, to a bunch of different places. And then Reagan was elected in the meantime, and he pulled the plug on these grants. So then I worked for the same doctor in an asbestos screening program where we saw building trades workers who had been exposed to asbestos and, of course, had asbestosis or cancer from their asbestos exposure. So I kind of deepened all that understanding about the public health of factory work or industrial work or working class occupations. And then because Reagan had pulled a plug on this grant, and then I lost the funding, so I went to work at Hopkins, Johns Hopkins, in the School of Public Health, and I worked for 14 years in different, I worked in injury prevention and I worked in HIV and AIDS research. And then the organizing bug just was growing in me. So in 1997, I had been asked to come to this conference at Evergreen College in the summer of, or the spring of 97. It must have been 1995, and it was the initial conference of a group called the National Organizers Alliance, which brought organizers together across the country to think about what kind of things were needed and necessary and what work was going on. So I went and I was on a fishbowl about SNCC, and with some other people, with Hardy Fry from Berkeley, with Mike Miller, with, I think Jerome Scott was on that fishbowl, but he had been in the black workers organizing in Detroit. But anyway, so I did that, and then I'm reading about organizing and learning about what's going on around the country, and so the bug is really getting a hold of me. So in 97, I'm calling Baltimore organizations to see if they want to send somebody to this conference in Colorado, which was another gathering of the National Organizers Alliance. And this woman is telling me, who works for Citizens Planning and Housing Association, which is a local nonprofit doing housing work and anti-crime work in Baltimore, working in all the neighborhoods where The Wire was actually filmed, interestingly enough. So she says to me, well, we don't have anybody to send to the conference, but do you know somebody who knows organizing who could be our lead organizer? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to apply for this job. And I actually got the job. I mean, I think I got it partly because I knew how to supervise people from my time at Hopkins, and partly because of my history and what I had been through. So I worked there for 8 years and it was neighborhood organizing. And then I had an OSI fellowship to bring organizers together across, Open Society Institute fellowship to bring organizers together across issues and constituencies. I did that. Then by then I'm like almost 65, not quite. And then I did a variety of different, well, when my fellowship ended, I was 65. So I've done a number of different organizing jobs. I worked for a union, I worked for a parent organizing group, I did some consulting on writing curriculum for community colleges on organizing so we could grow the number of organizers of color in the country, because a lot of the organizers, the professional organizers, and I'm putting quotes around professional, were white. I mean, they're from the big faith-based networks, those were mostly white organizers, and very often the nonprofits were hiring white people to go and organize, even if they were organizing in the Black community. So I worked on this curriculum for a couple of years, and yeah, that led me to showing up for racial justice. So that's my current work.
So the things from the civil rights movement, the modern movement, that the sort of 60s movement that you think are important that we haven't talked about?
I think we've pretty much covered it. I mean, if you gave me a prompt, I might say, oh yeah, we left that out. But yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
So what are some things that you think are important for people to know about the civil rights movement and organizing for social and racial justice?
I think people need to know what a movement is and what the window, what the energy level is during a movement, which we're certainly in a movement time now, and what the window is, however, because the window doesn't last that long. So the work that we have to do, the strategic thinking that we have to apply, we do need to go fast, but we also need to go slow to go fast. And, you know, we can't like move so fast. I mean, white culture says, you move fast, you get it done type of thing. But really that's, if we're in a moment of accountability, the way I'm thinking about it, we're in a moment of accountability, and we're in accountability with the Black Lives Matter movement. We can't go so fast that we move out ahead of where people are developing. And I think the form of the Black Lives Matter movement is going to be very different from the civil rights movement. The issues are similar but different, and the energy is definitely very similar, and the thinking and the depth of commitment is very similar. I think it's important for people to know that movements need resources, and that the white community has lots of resources, and we should be making a commitment to using some of our resources for sustaining Black Lives Matter organizations. For example, I do a monthly sustainer for showing up for racial justice, and I also have a monthly sustainer to the Baltimore Algebra Project, which is young people creating space for young people they tutor other young people in math, but they also do some organizing. And I also have a monthly sustainer with One DC, which is organizing neighborhood equity in DC, which is a really strong organization in Washington that organizes in the Black community, anti-gentrification organizing, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think so. Resources are important. I think scholarship is important. I think it's fabulous that there's been so much scholarship done of the 60s movement, and that we have young scholars like Emilye Crosby and Hassan Jeffries and others who have written these powerful books and lifted up the history. I think reading is important. I mean, you know, I despair at the fact that young people don't read anymore, right? And they kind of get these blips from the internet, but they don't read and study and process the history. So I think history, we have to lift up history and the importance of history, and I love it that the Library of Congress is doing these interviews. What else? Yeah, I think we're in a different moment now because we have global capital and we have this level of exploitation that's unseen, that's been unseen and that is obscene. So I think we have to be really thinking about the whole anti-war. How do we connect the sense of the Black Lives Matter movement with the anti-war organizing, with all the other human rights organizing, certainly with the identity politics of the gender, the gender non-conforming movement. I don't know if that's a movement yet, but the whole conversation about gender non-conforming structures, but how do we mesh all of that and for me, the Black movement is the center because I think because the country was birthed in such a exploitive relationship to the enslaved population and to slavery as the kind of the basis of the U.S. wealth, that has to be the straw that has to be where we focus our energy in order to open up all the other transformative processes and potential in the country. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. It was a pleasure to chat with the Library of Congress.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.